A Convert of the Mission, in selected stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Convert of the Mission. The largest tent of the Tasajara camp meeting was crowded to its utmost extent. The excitement of that dense mass was at its highest pitch. The Reverend Stephen Masterton, the single erect, passionate figure of that confused medley of kneeling worshippers, had reached the culminating pitch of his irresistible exhortatory power. Sighs and groans were beginning to respond to his appeals, when the reverend brother was seen to lurch heavily forward and fall to the ground. At first the effect was that of a part of his performance. The groans redoubled, and 20 or 30 brethren threw themselves prostrate in humble imitation of the preacher. But Sister Deborah Stokes, perhaps through some special revelation of feminine intuition, grasped the fallen man, tore loose his black silk necktie, and dragged him free of the struggling, frantic crowd whose paroxysms he had just evoked. Howbeit he was pale and unconscious, and unable to continue the service. Even the next day, when he had slightly recovered, it was found that any attempt to renew his fervid exhortations produced the same disastrous result. A council was hurriedly held by the elders. In spite of the energetic protests of Sister Stokes, it was held that the Lord was wrestling with his spirit, and he was subjected to the same extraordinary treatment from the whole congregation that he himself had applied to them. Propped up, pale and trembling, in the mourner's bench by 2 brethren, he was striven with, exhorted, prayed over, and admonished until insensibility mercifully succeeded convulsions. Spiritual therapeutics having failed, he was turned over to the weak and carnal nursing of womenfolk. But after a month of incapacity, he was obliged to yield to the flesh, and in the local dialect, to use a doctor. It so chanced that the medical practitioner of the district was a man of large experience, of military training and plain speech. When, therefore, he one day found in his surgery a man of rude Western type, strong-limbed and sunburned, but trembling, hesitating, and neurotic in movement, after listening to his symptoms gravely, he asked abruptly, "And how much are you drinking now?" "I am a lifelong abstainer," stammered his patient in quivering indignation. But this was followed by another question, so frankly appalling to the hearer that he staggered to his feet. "I'm Stephen Masterton, known of men as a circuit preacher, of the Northern California district," he thundered, "and an enemy of the flesh in all its forms." "I beg your pardon," responded Dr. Duchesne grimly, "but as you are suffering from excessive and repeated excitation of the nervous system, and the depression following prolonged artificial exaltation, it makes little difference whether the cause be spiritual, as long as there is a certain physical effect upon your body, which I believe you have brought to me to cure. Now as to diet, you look all wrong there." "My food is of the simplest. I have no hankering for flesh pots," responded the patient. "I suppose you call saleratus bread and salt pork and flapjacks simple," said the doctor coolly. "They are common enough, and if you were working with your muscles instead of your nerves, in that frame of yours, they might not hurt you. But you are suffering as much from eating more than you can digest as the veriest gourmand. You must stop all that. Go down to a quiet watering place for 2 months." "I go to a watering place?" interrupted Masterton. "To the haunt of the idle, the frivolous, and wanton? Never!" "Well, I'm not particular about a watering place," said the doctor with a shrug, "although a little idleness and frivolity with different food wouldn't hurt you. But you must go somewhere and change your habits and mode of life completely. I will find you some sleepy old Spanish town in the southern country where you can rest and diet. If this is distasteful to you," he continued grimly, "you can always call it a trial." Stephen Masterton may have thought so when, a week later, he found himself issuing from a rocky gorge into a rough, badly paved, hilly street, which seemed to be only a continuation of the mountain road itself. It broadened suddenly into a square or plaza, flanked on each side by an irregular row of yellowing adobe houses, with the inevitable veranda tienda in each corner, and the solitary galleried fonda, with a half-Moorish archway leading into an inner patio or courtyard in the center. The whole street stopped as usual at the very door of the mission church, a few hundred yards farther on, and under the shadow of the two belfry towers at each angle of the facade, as if this were the Ultima Thule of every traveler. But all that the eye rested on was ruined, worn, and crumbling. The adobe houses were cracked by the incessant sunshine of the half-year-long summer, or the more intermittent earthquake shock. The paved courtyard of the fonda was so uneven and sunken in the center that the lumbering wagon and faded diligencia stood on an incline, and the mules with difficulty kept their footing while being unladen. The whitened plaster had fallen from the feet of the two pillars that flanked the mission doorway like bandages from a gouty limb, leaving the reddish core of adobe visible. There were apparently as many broken tiles in the streets and alleys as there were on the heavy red roofs that everywhere asserted themselves, and even seemed to slide down the crumbling walls to the ground. There were hopeless gaps in grille and grating of doorways and windows, where the iron bars had dropped helplessly out, or were bent at different angles. The walls of the peaceful mission garden and the warlike presidio were alike lost in the escalading vines or leveled by the pushing boughs of gnarled pear and olive trees that now surmounted them. The dust lay thick and impalpable in hollow and gutter, and rose in little vapory clouds with a soft detonation at every stroke of his horse's hoofs. Over all this dust and ruin, idleness seemed to reign supreme. From the velvet-jacketed figures lounging motionless in the shadows of the open doorways, so motionless that only the lazy drift of cigarette smoke betokened their breathing, to the reclining peons in the shade of the catalpa, or the squatting Indians in the arroyo, all was sloth and dirt. The Reverend Stephen Masterton felt his throat swell with his old exhortative indignation. A gaudy yellow fan waved languidly in front of a black rose-crested head at a white-curtained window. He knew he was stifling with righteous wrath, and clapped his spurs to his horse. Nevertheless, in a few days, by the aid of a letter to the innkeeper, he was installed in a dilapidated adobe house, not unlike those he had seen, but situated in the outskirts and overlooking the garden and part of the refectory of the old mission. It had even a small garden of its own, if a strip of hot wall overburdened with yellow and white roses, a dozen straggling callias, a bank of heliotrope, and an almond tree could be called a garden. It had an open doorway, but so heavily recessed in the thick walls that it preserved seclusion, a sitting-room, and an alcoved bedroom with deep embrasured windows that, however, excluded the unwinking sunlight and kept an even monotone of shade. Strange to say, he found it cool, restful, and, in spite of the dust, absolutely clean, and, but for the scent of heliotrope, entirely inodorous. The dry air seemed to dissipate all noxious emanations and decay. The very dust itself, in its fine impalpability, was volatile with a spice-like piquancy, and left no stain. A wrinkled Indian woman, brown and veined like a tobacco leaf, ministered to his simple wants. But these wants had also been regulated by Dr. Duchesne. He found himself, with some grave doubts of his effeminacy, breakfasting on a single cup of chocolate instead of his usual bowl of molasses-sweetened coffee, crumbling a crisp tortilla instead of the heavy saleratus bread, greasy flapjack, or the lard-fried steak, and, more wonderful still, completing his repast with purple grapes from the mission wall. He could not deny that it was simple, that it was even refreshing and consistent with the climate and his surroundings. On the other hand, it was the frugal diet of the commonest peasant, and were not those peons slothful idolaters? At the end of the week, his correspondence being also restricted by his doctor to a few lines to himself regarding his progress, he wrote to that adviser: "The trembling and unquiet has almost ceased. I have less nightly turmoil and visions. My carnal appetite seems to be amply mollified and soothed by these viands, whatever may be their ultimate effect upon the weakness of our common sinful nature. but I should not be truthful to you if I did not warn you that I am viewing with the deepest spiritual concern a decided tendency toward sloth, and a folding of the hands over matters that often, I fear, are spiritual as well as temporal. I would ask you to consider, in a spirit of love, if it be not wise to rouse my apathetic flesh, so as to strive, even with the feeblest exhortations, against this sloth in others, if only to keep one's self from falling into the pit of easy indulgence. What answer he received is not known, but it is to be presumed that he kept loyal faith with his physician, and gave himself up to simple walks and rides and occasional meditation. His solitude was not broken in upon. Curiosity was too active a vice, and induced too much exertion for his indolent neighbors, and the Americano's basking seclusion, though unlike the habits of his countrymen, did not affect them. The shopkeeper and innkeeper saluted him always with a profound courtesy, which awakened his slight resentment, partly because he was conscious that it was grateful to him, and partly that he felt he ought to have provoked in them a less satisfied condition. Once, when he had unwittingly passed the confines of his own garden, through a gap in the mission orchard, a lissom, black-coated shadow slipped past him with an obeisance so profound and gentle that he was startled at first into an awkward imitation of it himself, and then into an angry self-examination. He knew that he loathed that long-skirted, woman-like garment, that dangling ostentatious symbol, that air of secrecy and mystery, and he inflated his chest above his loosely tied cravat and unbuttoned waistcoat with a contrasted sense of freedom. But he was conscious the next day of weakly avoiding a recurrence of this meeting, and in his self-examination put it down to his self-disciplined observance of his doctor's orders. But when he was strong again, and fitted for his master's work, how strenuously he should improve the occasion this gave him of attacking the Scarlet Woman among her slaves and worshippers. His afternoon meditations and the perusal of his only book, the Bible, were regularly broken in upon at about sunset by 2 or 3 strokes from the cracked bell that hung in the open belfry, which reared itself beyond the gnarled pear trees. He could not say that it was aggressive or persistent, like his own church bells, nor that it even expressed to him any religious sentiment. Moreover, it was not a Sabbath bell, but a daily one, and even then seemed to be only a signal to ears easily responsive, rather than a stern reminder, and the hour was always a singularly witching one. It was when the sun had slipped from the glaring red roofs, and the yellowing adobe of the mission walls and the tall ranks of wild oats on the hillside were all of the one color of old gold. It was when the quivering heat of the arroyo and dusty expanse of plaza was blending with the soft breath of the sea fog that crept through the clefts of the coast range, until a refreshing balm seemed to fall like a benediction on all nature. It was when the trade wind-swept and irritated surfaces of the rocky gorge beyond were soothed with clinging vapors, when the pines above no longer rocked monotonously, and the great undulating sea of the wild oat plains had gone down and was at rest. It was at this hour one afternoon that, with the released scents of the garden, there came to him a strange and subtle perfume that was new to his senses. He laid aside his book, went into the garden, and, half unconscious of his trespass, passed through the mission orchard, and thence into the little churchyard beside the church. Looking at the strange inscriptions in an unfamiliar tongue, he was singularly touched with the few cheap memorials lying upon the graves, like childish toys, and for the moment overlooked the papistic emblems that accompanied them. It struck him vaguely that death, the common leveler, had made even the symbols of a faith eternal inferior to those simple records of undying memory and affection, and he was for a moment startled into doubt. He walked to the door of the church. To his surprise, it was open. Standing upon the threshold, he glanced inside, and stood for a moment utterly bewildered. In a man of refined taste and education, that bizarre and highly colored interior would have only provoked a smile or shrug. To Stephen Masterton's highly emotional nature, but artistic inexperience, strangely enough, it was profoundly impressive. The heavily timbered, roughly hewn roof, barred with alternate bands of blue and Indian red, the crimson hangings, The gold and black draperies affected this religious backwoodsman exactly as they were designed to affect the heathen and acolytes for whose conversion the temple had been reared. He could scarcely take his eyes from the tinsel-crowned Mother of Heaven, resplendent in white and gold and glittering with jewels. The radiant shield before the host, illuminated by tall spectral candles in the mysterious obscurity of the altar, dazzled him like the rayed disk of the setting sun. A gentle murmur, as of the distant sea, came from the altar. In his naive bewilderment he had not seen the few kneeling figures in the shadow of column and aisle. It was not until a man whom he recognized as a muleteer he had seen that afternoon gambling and drinking in the fonda slipped by him like a shadow and sank upon his knees in the center of the aisle that he realized the overpowering truth. He, Stephen Masterton, was looking upon some rite of popish idolatry. He was turning quickly away when the keeper of the tienda, a man of sloth and sin, gently approached him from the shadow of a column with a mute gesture which he took to be one of invitation. A fierce protest of scorn and indignation swelled to his throat, but died upon his lips. Yet he had strength enough to erect his gaunt, emaciated figure, throwing out his long arms and extended palms in the attitude of defiant exorcism, and then rush swiftly from the church. As he did so, he thought he saw a faint smile cross the shopkeeper's face, and a whispered exchange of words with a neighboring worshipper of more exalted appearance came to his ears, but it was not intelligible to his comprehension. The next day he wrote to his doctor in that quaint grandiloquence of written speech with which the half-educated man balances the slips of his colloquial phrasing. "Do not let the purgation of my flesh be unduly protracted. What with the sloth and idolatries of Baal and Ashtaroth, which I see daily around me, I feel that without a protest not only the flesh but the spirit is mortified. But my bodily strength is mercifully returning, and I found myself yesterday able to take a long ride at that hour which they here keep sacred for an idolatrous rite under the beautiful name of the Angelus. Thus do they bear false witness to him. Can you tell me the meaning of the Spanish words Don Quixote? I am ignorant of these sensuous southern languages, and am aware that this is not the correct spelling, but I have striven to give the phonetic equivalent. It was used, I am inclined to think, in reference to myself, by an idolater. P.S. You need not trouble yourself. I have just ascertained that the words in question were simply the title of an idle novel, and, of course, could not possibly refer to me. Howbeit, it was as Don Quixote, that is, the common Spaniard's conception of the Knight of La Mancha, merely the simple fanatic and madman, that Mr. Stephen Masterton ever after rode all unconsciously through the streets of the Mission, amid the half-pitying, half-smiling glances of the people. In spite of his meditations, his single volume, and his habit of retiring early, he found his evenings were growing lonely and tedious. He missed the prayer meeting and, above all, the hymns. He had a fine baritone voice, sympathetic, as may be imagined, but not cultivated. One night, in the seclusion of his garden, and secure in his distance from other dwellings, he raised his voice in a familiar camp-meeting hymn with a strong Covenanter's ring in the chorus. Growing bolder as he went on, he at last filled the quiet night with the strenuous sweep of his chant. Surprised at his own fervor, he paused for a moment, listening, half frightened, half ashamed of his outbreak. But there was only the trilling of the night wind in the leaves, or the far-off yelp of a coyote. For a moment he thought he heard the metallic twang of a stringed instrument in the mission garden beyond his own, and remembered his contiguity to the church with a stir of defiance. But he was relieved, nevertheless. His pent-up emotion had found vent, and without the nervous excitement that had followed his old exaltation. That night he slept better. He had found the Lord again, with psalmody. The next evening he chanced upon a softer hymn of the same simplicity, but with a vein of human tenderness in its aspirations, which his more hopeful mood gently rendered. At the conclusion of the first verse he was, however, distinctly conscious of being followed by the same twanging sound he had heard on the previous night, and which even his untutored ear could recognize as an attempt to accompany him. But before he had finished the second verse, the unknown player, after an ingenious but ineffectual essay to grasp the right chord, abandoned it with an impatient and almost pettish flourish, and a loud bang upon the sounding board of the unseen instrument. Masterton finished it alone. With his curiosity excited, however, he tried to discover the locality of the hidden player. The sound evidently came from the mission garden, but in his ignorance of the language he could not even interrogate his Indian housekeeper. On the third night, however, his hymn was uninterrupted by any sound from the former musician. A sense of disappointment, he knew not why, came over him. The kindly overture of the unseen player had been a relief to his loneliness, yet he had barely concluded the hymn when the familiar sound again struck his ears. But this time the musician played boldly, confidently, and with a singular skill on the instrument. The brilliant prelude over, to his entire surprise and some confusion, a soprano voice, high, childish, but infinitely quaint and fascinating, was mischievously uplifted. But alas, even to his ears, ignorant of the language, it was very clearly a song of levity and wantonness, of freedom and license, of coquetry and incitement. Yet such was its fascination that he fancied it was reclaimed by the delightful childlike and innocent expression of the singer. Enough that this tall, gaunt, broad-shouldered man arose, and, overcome by a curiosity almost as childlike, slipped into the garden and glided with an Indian softness of tread toward the voice. The moon shone full upon the ruined mission wall tipped with clusters of dark foliage. Half hiding, half mingling with one of them, an indistinct bulk of light-colored huddled fleeces like an extravagant bird's nest, hung the unknown musician. So intent was the performer's preoccupation that Masterton actually reached the base of the wall immediately below the figure without attracting its attention. But his foot slipped on the crumbling debris with a snapping of dried twigs. There was a quick little cry from above. He had barely time to recover his position before the singer, impulsively leaning over the parapet, had lost hers and fell outward. But Masterton was tall, alert, and self-possessed, and threw out his long arms. The next moment they were full of soft flounces. A struggling figure was against his breast, and a woman's frightened little hands around his neck. But he had broken her fall, and almost instantly, yet with infinite gentleness, he released her unharmed, with hardly her crisp flounces crumpled, in an upright position against the wall. Even her guitar, still hanging from her shoulder by a yellow ribbon, had bounded elastic and resounding against the wall, but lay intact at her satin-slippered feet. She caught it up with another quick little cry, but this time more of sauciness than fear, and drew her little hand across its strings half defiantly. "I hope you're not hurt," said the circuit preacher gravely. She broke into a laugh so silvery that he thought it no extravagance to liken it to the moonbeams that played over her, made audible. She was lithe, yet plump, barred with black and yellow, and small-waisted like a pretty wasp. Her complexion in that light was a sheen of pearl satin that made her eyes blacker and her little mouth redder than any other color could. She was small, but, remembering the 14-year-old wife of the shopkeeper, he felt that, for all her childish voice and features, she was a grown woman, and a sudden shyness took hold of him. But she looked pertly in his face, stood her guitar upright before her, and put her hands behind her back as she leaned saucily against the wall and shrugged her shoulders. "It was the fault of you," she said in a broken English that seemed as much infantine as foreign. "What for you not remain to yourself in your own casa? So it come. You creep so in the dark, and shake my wall, and I fall. And she," pointing to the guitar, "is almost broke. And for all this, I have only make to you a serenade. Ingrate!" "I beg your pardon," said Masterton quickly. "But I was curious. I thought I might help you, and—" "Make yourself another cat on the wall, eh? No, one is enough, thank you." A frown lowered on Masterton's brow. "You don't understand me," he said bluntly. "I did not know who was here."
Ah, bueno. Then it is Pepita Ramirez, you see, she said, tapping her bodice with one little finger. All the same, the niece from Manuel Garcia, who keeps the mission garden and live there. And you?
My name is Masterton.
How much?
Masterton, he repeated. She tried to pronounce it once or twice desperately, and then shook her little head so violently that a yellow rose fastened over her ear fell to the ground. But she did not heed it, nor the fact that Masterton had picked it up.
Ah, I cannot, she said poutingly. It is as difficult to make go as my guitar with your serenade.
Can you not say Stephen Masterton? He asked more gently, with a returning and forgiving sense of her childishness.
Estefan? Ah, Esteban. Yes, Don Esteban. Bueno. Then, Don Esteban, what for you sing so melancholy one night, and one night so fierce? The melancholy, he is not so bad, but the fierce, ah, he is wicked. Is it how the Americano make always his serenade?
Masterton's brow again darkened, and his hymn of exultation had been mistaken by these people, by this wanton child. It was no serenade, he replied curtly. It was in the praise of the Lord.
Of how much?
Of the Lord of hosts, of the Almighty in heaven. He lifted his long arms reverently on high.
Oh,
she said, with a frightened look, slightly edging away from the wall. At a secure distance she stopped.
Then you are a soldier, Don Esteban?
No.
Then what for you think I am a soldier of the Lord, and you will make die in his army? Oh, yes, you have said.
She gathered up her guitar tightly under her arm, shook her small finger at him gravely, and said,
You are a humbug, Don Esteban. Good a night.
And began to glide away. One moment, Miss Ramirez, called Masterton. That is, you have forgotten your rose, he added feebly, holding up the flower. She halted.
Ah, yes, he have drop. You have pick him up. He is yours. I have drop. You have pick me up, but I am not yours. Good a night, Comandante Don Esteban.
With a light laugh she ran along beside the wall for a little distance, suddenly leaped up and disappeared in one of the largest gaps in its ruined and helpless structure. Stephen Masterton gazed after her stupidly, still holding the rose in his hand. Then he threw it away and re-entered his home. Lighting his candle, he undressed himself, prayed fervently, so fervently that all remembrance of the idle, foolish incident was wiped from his mind, and went to bed. He slept well and dreamlessly. The next morning, when his thoughts recurred to the previous night, this seemed to him a token that he had not deviated from his spiritual integrity. It did not occur to him that the thought itself was a tacit suspicion. So his feet quite easily sought the garden again in the early sunshine, even to the wall where she had stood. But he had not taken into account the vivifying freshness of the morning, the renewed promise of life and resurrection in the pulsing air and potent sunlight, and as he stood there he seemed to see the figure of the young girl again, leaning against the wall in all the charm of her irrepressible and innocent youth. More than that, he found the whole scene reenacting itself before him. The nebulous drapery half hidden in the foliage, the cry and the fall, the momentary soft contact of the girl's figure against his own, the clinging arms around his neck, the brush and fragrance of her flounces, all this came back to him with a strength he had not felt when it occurred. He was turning hurriedly away when his eyes fell upon the yellow rose still lying in the debris where he had thrown it, but still pure, fresh, and unfaded. He picked it up again, with a singular fancy that it was the girl herself, and carried it into the house. As he placed it half shyly in a glass on his table, a wonderful thought occurred to him. Was not the episode of last night a special providence? Was not that young girl, wayward and childlike, a mere neophyte in her idolatrous religion, as yet unsteeped in sloth and ignorance, presented to him as a brand to be snatched from the burning? Was not this the opportunity of conversion he had longed for? This the chance of exercising his gifts of exhortation that he had been hiding in the napkin of solitude and seclusion? Nay, was not all this predestined? His illness, his consequent exile to this land of false gods, this contiguity to the mission, was not all this part of a supremely ordered plan for the girl's salvation? And was he not elected and ordained for that service? Nay, more, was not the girl herself a mere unconscious instrument in the hands of a higher power? Was not her voluntary attempt to accompany him in his devotional exercise a vague stirring of that predestined force within her? Was not even that wantonness and frivolity, contrasted with her childishness, which he had at first misunderstood, the stirrings of the flesh and the spirit, and was he to abandon her in that struggle of good and evil? He lifted his bowed head, that had been resting on his arm before the little flower on the table, as if it were a shrine, with a flash of resolve in his blue eyes. The wrinkled Concepcion, coming to her duties in the morning, scarcely recognized her gloomily abstracted master in this transfigured man. He looked 10 years younger. She met his greeting, and the few direct inquiries that his new resolve enabled him to make more freely, with some information, which a later talk with the shopkeeper, who had a fuller English vocabulary, confirmed in detail. Yes, truly this was a niece of the mission gardener, who lived with her uncle in the ruined wing of the Presidio. She had taken her first communion 4 years ago. Ah, yes, she was a great musician, and could play on the organ. And the guitar, ah, yes, of a certainty. She was gay, and flirted with the caballeros, young and old, but she cared not for any. Whatever satisfaction this latter statement gave Masterton, he believed it was because the absence of any disturbing worldly affection would make her an easier convert. But how continue this chance acquaintance and effect her conversion? For the first time Masterton realized the value of expediency. While his whole nature impelled him to seek her society frankly and publicly, and exhort her openly, he knew that this was impossible. Still more, he remembered her unmistakable fright at his first expression of faith. He must be wise as the serpent and harmless as the dove. He must work upon her soul alone and secretly. He, who would have shrunk from any clandestine association with a girl from mere human affection, saw no wrong in a covert intimacy for the purpose of religious salvation. Ignorant as he was of the ways of the world, and inexperienced in the usages of society, he began to plan methods of secretly meeting her with all the intrigue of a gallant. The perspicacity, as well as the intuition of a true lover, had descended upon him in this effort of mere spiritual conquest. Armed with his information and a few Spanish words, he took the yellow Concepcion aside, and gravely suborned her to carry a note to be delivered secretly to Miss Ramirez. To his great relief and some surprise, the old woman grinned with intelligence, and her withered hand closed with a certain familiar dexterity over the epistle and the accompanying gratuity. To a man less naively one-ideaed, it might have awakened some suspicion, but to the more sanguine hopefulness of Masterton, it only suggested the fancy that Concepcion herself might prove to be open to conversion, and that he should in due season attempt her salvation also. But that would be later, for Concepcion was always with him and accessible. The girl was not. The note, which had cost him some labor of composition, simple and almost businesslike as was the result, ran as follows: I wish to see you upon some matter of grave concern to yourself. Will you oblige me by coming again to the wall of the mission tonight at early candlelight? It would avert worldly suspicion if you brought also your guitar. The afternoon dragged slowly on. Concepcion returned. She had with great difficulty managed to see the señorita, but not alone. She had, however, slipped the note into her hand, not daring to wait for an answer. In his first hopefulness, Masterton did not doubt what the answer would be, but as evening approached he grew concerned as to the girl's opportunities of coming, and regretted that he had not given her a choice of time. Before his evening meal was finished, he began to fear for her willingness, and doubt the potency of his note. He was accustomed to exhort orally. Perhaps he ought to have waited for the chance of speaking to her directly without writing. When the moon rose, he was already in the garden. Lingering at first in the shadow of an olive tree, he waited until the moonbeams fell on the wall and its crests of foliage. But nothing moved among that ebony tracery. His ear was strained for the familiar tinkle of the guitar. All was silent. As the moon rose higher, he at last boldly walked to the wall and listened for any movement on the other side of it, but nothing stirred. She was evidently not coming. His note had failed. He was turning away sadly, but as he faced his home again, he heard a light laugh beside him. He stopped. A black shadow stepped out from beneath his own almond tree. He started when, with a gesture that seemed familiar to him, the upper part of the shadow seemed to fall away with a long black mantilla, and the face of the young girl was revealed. He could see now that she was clad in black lace from head to foot. She looked taller, older, and he fancied even prettier than before. A sudden doubt of his ability to impress her, a swift realization of all the difficulties of the attempt, and for the first time perhaps a dim perception of the incongruity of the situation, came over him. "I was looking for you on the wall," he stammered.
Madre de Dios, she retorted with a laugh and her old audacity. You would that I shall always hang there and drop upon you like a pear when you shake the tree? No.
"You haven't brought your guitar," he continued, still more awkwardly, as he noticed that she held only a long black fan in her hand.
For why? You would that I play it, and when my uncle say, "Where go Pepita? She is lost," someone shall say, "Oh, I have hear her tink-a-tink in the garden of the Americano, who live alone." And then it is finish.
Masterton began to feel exceedingly uncomfortable. There was something in this situation that he had not dreamed of. But with the persistency of an awkward man, he went on. "But you played on the wall the other night, and tried to accompany me."
"But that was last night, and on the wall. I had not speak to you. You had not speak to me. You had not sent me the little note by your peon."
She stopped, and suddenly opening her fan before her face, so that only her mischievous eyes were visible, added,
"You had not asked me then to come to hear you make love to me, Don Esteban. That is the difference."
The circuit preacher felt the blood rush to his face. Anger, shame, mortification, remorse, and fear alternately strove with him, but above all and through all he was conscious of a sharp, exquisite pleasure that frightened him still more. Yet he managed to exclaim, "No, no, you cannot think me capable of such a cowardly trick." The girl started, more at the unmistakable sincerity of his utterance than at the words, whose full meaning she may have only imperfectly caught.
"A trick? A trick?"
she slowly and wonderingly repeated. Then suddenly, as if comprehending him, she turned her round black eyes full upon him, and dropped her fan from her face.
"And what for you ask me to come here, then?"
"I wanted to talk with you," he began, "on far more serious matters. I wished to—" But he stopped. He could not address this quaint child woman staring at him in black-eyed wonder, in either the measured or the impetuous terms with which he would have exhorted a mature, responsible being. He made a step toward her. She drew back, striking at his extended hand half impatiently, half mischievously with her fan. He flushed, and then burst out bluntly, "I want to talk with you about your soul."
"My what?"
"Your immortal soul, unhappy girl."
"What have you to make with that? Are you a devil?"
Her eyes grew rounder, though she faced him boldly. "I am a minister of the gospel," he said in hurried entreaty. "You must hear me for a moment. I would save your soul."
"My immortal soul live with the padre at the mission. You must seek her there. My mortal body," she added with a mischievous smile, "say to you good night, Don Esteban."
She dropped him a little curtsy and ran away. "One moment, Miss Ramirez," said Masterton eagerly, but she had already slipped beyond his reach. He saw her little black figure passing swiftly beside the moonlit wall, saw it suddenly slide into a shadowy fissure and vanish. In his blank disappointment he could not bear to re-enter the house he had left so sanguinely a few moments before, but walked moodily in the garden. His discomfiture was the more complete since he felt that his defeat was owing to some mistake in his methods, and not the incorrigibility of his subject. Was it not a spiritual weakness in him to have resented so sharply the girl's imputation that he wished to make love to her? He should have borne it as Christians had even before now borne slander and false testimony for their faith. He might even have accepted it and let the triumph of her conversion in the end prove his innocence. Or was his purpose incompatible with that sisterly affection he had so often preached to the women of his flock? He might have taken her hand and called her Sister Pepita, even as he had called Deborah sister. He recalled the fact that he had for an instant held her struggling in his arms. He remembered the thrill that the recollection had caused him, and somehow it now sent a burning blush across his face. He hurried back into the house. The next day 1,000 wild ideas took the place of his former settled resolution. He would seek the padre, this custodian of the young girl's soul. He would convince him of his error, or beseech him to give him an equal access to her spirit. He would seek the uncle of the girl and work upon his feelings. Then, for 3 or 4 days, he resolved to put the young girl from his mind, trusting after the fashion of his kind for some special revelation from a supreme source as an indication for his conduct. This revelation presently occurred, as it is apt to occur when wanted. One evening his heart leaped at the familiar sound of Pepita's guitar in the distance. Whatever his ultimate intention now, he hurriedly ran into the garden. The sound came from the former direction, but as he unhesitatingly approached the mission wall, he could see that she was not upon it, and as the notes of her guitar were struck again, he knew that they came from the other side. But the chords were a prelude to one of his own hymns, and he stood entranced as her sweet, childlike voice rose with the very words that he had sung. The few defects were those of purely oral imitation. The accents, even the slight reiteration of the S, were Pepita's own.
Children of the heavenly King, as ye journey as sweetly as sing your great Redeemer's praise, glorious in his works and ways.
He was astounded. Her recollection of the air and words was the more wonderful, for he remembered now that he had only sung that particular hymn once. But to his still greater delight and surprise, her voice rose again in the second verse, with a touch of plaintiveness that swelled his throat.
We are traveling home to God, in the way our fathers trod. They are happy now, and we soon their happiness shall see.
The simple, almost childish words, so childish that they might have been the fitting creation of her own childish lips, here died away with a sweep and crash of the whole strings. Breathless silence followed, in which Stephen Masterton could feel the beatings of his own heart. "Miss Ramirez," he called, in a voice that scarcely seemed his own. There was no reply. "Pepita," he repeated. It was strangely like the accent of a lover, but he no longer cared. Still the singer's voice was silent. Then he ran swiftly beside the wall, as he had seen her run, until he came to the fissure. It was overgrown with vines and brambles, almost as impenetrable as an abattis, but if she had pierced it in her delicate crepe dress, so could he. He brushed roughly through and found himself in a glimmering aisle of pear trees close by the white wall of the mission church. For a moment, in that intricate tracing of ebony and ivory made by the rising moon, he was dazzled, but evidently his eruption into the orchard had not been as lithe and silent as her own, for a figure in a parti-colored dress suddenly started into activity, and running from the wall, began to course through the trees until it became apparently a part of that involved pattern. Nothing daunted, however, Stephen Masterton pursued. His speed increased as he recognized the flounces of Pepita's barred dress, but the young girl had the advantage of knowing the locality, and could evade her pursuer by unsuspected turns and doubles. For some moments this fanciful sylvan chase was kept up in perfect silence. It might have been a woodland nymph pursued by a wandering shepherd. Masterton presently saw that she was making toward a tiled roof that was now visible as projecting over the Presidio wall, and was evidently her goal of refuge. He redoubled his speed. With skillful audacity and sheer strength of his broad shoulders, he broke through a dense ceanothus hedge which Pepita was swiftly skirting, and suddenly appeared between her and her house. With her first cry, the young girl turned and tried to bury herself in the hedge. But in another stride the circuit preacher was at her side and caught her panting figure in his arms. While he had been running, he had swiftly formulated what he should do and what he should say to her. To his simple appeal for her companionship and willing ear, he would add a brotherly tenderness that should invite her trustfulness in him. He would confess his wrong and ask her forgiveness of his abrupt solicitations. He would propose to teach her more hymns. They would practice psalmody together. Even this priest, the custodian of her soul, could not object to that. But chiefly he would thank her. He would tell her how she had pleased him, and this would lead to more serious and thoughtful converse. All this was in his mind while he ran, was upon his lips as he caught her, and for an instant she lapsed, exhausted, in his arms. But alas! Even in that moment he suddenly drew her toward him and kissed her as only a lover could. The wire grass was already yellowing on the Tasajara plains with the dusty decay of the long, dry summer when Dr. Duchesne returned to Tasajara. He came to see the wife of Deacon Sanderson, who, having for the 12th time added to the population of the settlement, was not doing as well as everybody, except possibly Dr. Duchesne, expected. After he had made this hollow-eyed, overburdened, undernourished woman as comfortable as he could in her rude, neglected surroundings, to change the dreary chronicle of suffering, he turned to the husband and said, "And what has become of Mr. Masterton, who used to be in your vocation?" A long groan came from the deacon. "Hallo, I hope he has not had a relapse," said the doctor earnestly. "I thought I'd knocked all that nonsense out of him. I beg your pardon. I mean," he added hurriedly, "he wrote to me only a few weeks ago that he was picking up his strength again and doing well." "In his weak, gross, sinful flesh, yes, no doubt," returned the deacon scornfully, "and perhaps even in a worldly sense, for those who value the vanities of life. But he is lost to us for all time, and lost to eternal life forever. Not," he continued in sanctimonious vindictiveness, "but that I often had my doubts of Brother Masterton's steadfastness. He was too much given to imagery and song." "But what has he done?" persisted Dr. Duchesne. "Done? He has embraced the Scarlet Woman." "Dear me," said the doctor, "so soon? Is it anybody you knew here? Not anybody's wife, eh?" "He has entered the Church of Rome," said the deacon indignantly. "He has forsaken the God of his fathers for the tents of the idolaters. He is the consort of papists, and the slave of the Pope." "But are you sure?" said Dr. Duchesne, with perhaps less concern than before. "Sure," returned the deacon angrily. "Didn't Brother Bulkley, on account of warning reports made by a God-fearing and soul-seeking teamster, make a special pilgrimage to this land of Sodom to inquire and spy out its wickedness? Didn't he find Stephen Masterton steeped in the iniquity of practicing on an organ, he that scorned even a violin or harmonium in the tents of the Lord, in an idolatrous chapel, with a foreign female papist for a teacher? Didn't he find him a guest at the board of a Jesuit priest, visiting the schools of the mission where this young Jezebel of a singer teaches the children to chant in unknown tongues? Didn't he find him living with a wrinkled Indian witch who called him Padroni, and speaking her gibberish? Didn't he find him, who left here a man mortified in flesh and spirit, and pale with striving with sinners, fat and rosy from native wines and flesh-pots, and even vain and gaudy in colored apparel? And last of all, didn't Brother Bulkley hear that a rumor was spread far and wide that this miserable backslider was to take to himself a wife in one of these strange women, that very Jezebel who seduced him? What do you call that?" "It looks a good deal like human nature," said the doctor musingly. "But I call it a cure." End of A Convert of the Mission. The Indiscretion of Elsbeth, in Selected Stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Selected Stories by Bret Harte. The Indiscretion of Elsbeth. The American paused. He had evidently lost his way. For the last half hour he had been wandering in a medieval town, in a profound medieval dream. Only a few days had elapsed since he had left the steamship that carried him hither, and the accents of his own tongue, the idioms of his own people, and the sympathetic community of New World tastes and expressions still filled his mind until he woke up, or rather, as it seemed to him, was falling asleep in the past of this Old World town which had once held his ancestors. Although a Republican, he had liked to think of them in quaint, distinctive garb, representing state and importance, perhaps even aristocratic preeminence, content to let the responsibility of such bad eminence rest with them entirely. But a habit of conscientiousness and a love for historic truth eventually led him also to regard an honest bower standing beside his cattle in the quaint marketplace, or a kindly-faced, black-eyed Dienstmädchen in a doorway, with a timid, respectful interest, as a possible type of his progenitors. For, unlike some of his traveling countrymen in Europe, he was not a snob, and it struck him, as an American, that it was perhaps better to think of his race as having improved than as having degenerated. In these ingenuous meditations he had passed the long rows of quaint high houses, whose sagging roofs and unpatched dilapidations were yet far removed from squalor, until he had reached the road bordered by poplars, all so unlike his own country's waysides, and knew that he had wandered far from his hotel. He did not care, however, to retrace his steps and return by the way he had come. There was, he reasoned, some other street or turning that would eventually bring him to the marketplace and his hotel, and yet extend his experience of the town. He turned at right angles into a narrow grass lane, which was, however, as neatly kept and apparently as public as the highway. A few moments' walking convinced him that it was not a thoroughfare, and that it led to the open gates of a park. This had something of a public look, which suggested that his intrusion might be at least a pardonable trespass, and he relied, like most strangers, on the exonerating quality of a stranger's ignorance. The park lay in the direction he wished to go, and yet it struck him as singular that a park of such extent should be still allowed to occupy such valuable urban space. Indeed, its length seemed to be illimitable as he wandered on, until he became conscious that he must have again lost his way, and he diverged toward the only boundary, a high, thick-set hedge to the right, whose line he had been following. As he neared it, he heard the sound of voices on the other side, speaking in German, with which he was unfamiliar. Having as yet met no one, and being now impressed with the fact that for a public place the park was singularly deserted, he was conscious that his position was getting serious, and he determined to take this only chance of inquiring his way. The hedge was thinner in some places than in others, and at times he could see not only the light through it, but even the moving figures of the speakers, and the occasional white flash of a summer gown. At last he determined to penetrate it, and with little difficulty emerged on the other side. But here he paused motionless. He found himself behind a somewhat formal and symmetrical group of figures with their backs toward him, but all stiffened into attitudes as motionless as his own, and all gazing with a monotonous intensity in the direction of some handsome building which had been invisible above the hedge, but which now seemed to arise suddenly before him. Some of the figures were in uniform. Immediately before him, but so slightly separated from the others that he was enabled to see the house between her and her companions, he was confronted by the pretty back, shoulders, and blonde braids of a young girl of 20. Convinced that he had unwittingly intruded upon some august ceremonial, he instantly slipped back into the hedge, but so silently that his momentary presence was evidently undetected. When he regained the park side, he glanced back through the interstices. There was no movement of the figures, nor a break in the silence to indicate that his intrusion had been observed. With a long breath of relief, he hurried from the park. It was late when he finally got back to his hotel, but his little modern adventure had, I fear, quite outrun his previous medieval reflections, and almost his first inquiry of the silver-chained porter in the courtyard was in regard to the park. There was no public park in Alstadt. The Herr possibly alluded to the Hofgardens, the Schloss, which was in the direction he indicated. The Schloss was the residency of the hereditary Grand Duke. Jawohl, he was stopping there with several Hoheiten. There was naturally a party there, a family reunion, but it was a private enclosure. At times when the Grand Duke was not in residence, it was open to the public. In point of fact, at such times tickets of admission were to be had at the hotel for 50 pfennige each. There was not, of truth, much to see, except a model farm and dairy, the pretty toy of a previous Grand Duchess. But he seemed destined to come into closer collision with the modern life of Alstadt. On entering the hotel, wearied by his long walk, he passed the landlord and a man in half-military uniform on the landing near his room. As he entered his apartment, he had a vague impression, without exactly knowing why, that the landlord and the military stranger had just left it. This feeling was deepened by the evident disarrangement of certain articles in his unlocked portmanteau and the disorganization of his writing-case. A wave of indignation passed over him. It was followed by a knock at the door, and the landlord blandly appeared with the stranger. "1,000 pardons," said the former smilingly, "but Herr Sandermann, the Ober-Inspector of Police, wishes to speak with you. I hope we are not intruding?" "Not now," said the American dryly. The two exchanged a vacant and deprecating smile. "I have to ask only a few formal questions," said the Ober-Inspector, in excellent but somewhat precise English, "to supplement the report which, as a stranger, you may not know is required by the police from the landlord in regard to the names and quality of his guests who are foreign to the town. You have a passport?" "I have," said the American still more dryly, "but I do not keep it in an unlocked portmanteau or an open writing-case." "An admirable precaution," said Sanderman, with unmoved politeness. "May I see it? Thanks." He added, glancing over the document which the American produced from his pocket, "I see that you are a born American citizen, and an earlier knowledge of that fact would have prevented this little contretemps. You are aware, Mr. Hoffman, that your name is German?" "It was borne by my ancestors who came from this country 2 centuries ago," said Hoffman curtly. "We are indeed honored by your return to it," returned Sanderman suavely, "but it was the circumstance of your name being a local one, and the possibility of your still being a German citizen liable to unperformed military duty, which has caused the trouble." His manner was clearly civil and courteous, but Hoffman felt that all the time his own face and features were undergoing a profound scrutiny from the speaker. "And you are making sure that you will know me again?" said Hoffman, with a smile. "I trust, indeed, both," returned Sanderman with a bow, "although you will permit me to say that your description here," pointing to the passport, "scarcely does you justice. Ach Gott! It is the same in all countries. The official eye is not that of the young Damen." Hoffman, though not conceited, had not lived 20 years without knowing that he was very good-looking, yet there was something in the remark that caused him to color with new uneasiness. The Ober-Inspector rose with another bow, and moved toward the door. "I hope you will let me make amends for this intrusion by doing anything I can to render your visit here a pleasant one. Perhaps," he added, "it is not for long." But Hoffman evaded the evident question, as he resented what he imagined was a possible sneer. "I have not yet determined my movements," he said. The Ober-Inspector brought his heels together in a somewhat stiffer military salute and departed. Nothing, however, could have exceeded the later, almost servile urbanity of the landlord, who seemed to have been proud of the official visit to his guest. He was profuse in his attentions, and even introduced him to a singularly artistic-looking man of middle age, wearing an order in his buttonhole, whom he met casually in the hall. "Our court photographer," explained the landlord with some fervor, "at whose studio, only a few houses distant, most of the Hoheiten and Prinzessinnen of Germany have sat for their likenesses." "I should feel honored if the distinguished American Herr would give me a visit," said the stranger gravely, as he gazed at Hoffman with an intensity which recalled the previous scrutiny of the police inspector, "and I would be charmed if he would avail himself of my poor skill to transmit his picturesque features to my unique collection." Hoffman returned a polite evasion to this invitation, although he was conscious of being struck with this second examination of his face and the allusion to his personality. The next morning the porter met him with a mysterious air. The Herr would still like to see the Schloss? Hoffman, who had quite forgotten his adventure in the park, looked vacant. Jawohl! The Hof authorities had no doubt heard of his visit, and had intimated to the hotel proprietor that he might have permission to visit the model farm and dairy. As the American still looked indifferent, the porter pointed out with some importance that it was a ducal courtesy not to be lightly treated, that few, indeed, of the burghers themselves had ever been admitted to this eccentric whim of the late Grand Duchess. He would, of course, be silent about it. The court would not like it known that they had made an exception to their rules in favor of a foreigner. He would enter quickly and boldly alone. There would be a housekeeper or a dairymaid to show him over the place. More amused at this important mystery over what he, as an American, was inclined to classify as a free pass to a somewhat heavy side show, he gravely accepted the permission, and the next morning after breakfast set out to visit the model farm and dairy. Dismissing his driver, as he had been instructed, Hoffman entered the gateway with a mingling of expectancy and a certain amusement over the boldness which the porter had suggested should characterize his entrance. Before him was a beautifully kept lane bordered by arbored and trellised roses, which seemed to sink into the distance. He was instinctively following it when he became aware that he was mysteriously accompanied by a man in the livery of a chasseur, who was walking among the trees almost abreast of him, keeping pace with his step, and after the first introductory military salute preserving a ceremonious silence. There was something so ludicrous in this solemn procession toward a peaceful rural industry that by the time they had reached the bottom of the lane the American had quite recovered his good humor. But here a new astonishment awaited him. Nestling before him in a green amphitheater lay a little wooden farmyard and outbuildings, which irresistibly suggested that it had been recently unpacked and set up from a box of Nuremberg toys. The symmetrical trees, the galleried houses with preternaturally glazed windows, even the spotty, disproportionately sized cows in the white-fenced barnyards were all unreal, wooden, and toy-like. Crossing a miniature bridge over a little stream, from which he was quite prepared to hook metallic fish with a magnet their own size, he looked about him for some real being to dispel the illusion. The mysterious chasseur had disappeared, but under the arch of an arbor, which seemed to be composed of silk ribbons, green glass, and pink tissue paper, stood a quaint but delightful figure. At first it seemed as if he had only dispelled one illusion for another, for the figure before him might have been made of Dresden china, so daintily delicate and unique it was in color and arrangement. It was that of a young girl dressed in some forgotten medieval peasant garb of velvet braids, silver stay-laced corsage, lace sleeves, and helmeted metallic comb. But, after the Dresden method, the pale yellow of her hair was repeated in her bodice, the pink of her cheeks was in the roses of her chintz overskirt, the blue of her eyes was in the blue of her petticoat, the dazzling whiteness of her neck shone again in the sleeves and stockings. Nevertheless, she was real and human, for the pink deepened in her cheeks as Hoffman's hat flew from his head, and she recognized the civility with a grave little curtsy. "You have come to see the dairy?" she said in quaintly accurate English. "I will show you the way." "If you please," said Hoffman, gaily. "But—" "But what?" she said, facing him suddenly with absolutely astonished eyes. Hoffman looked into them so long that their frank wonder presently contracted into an ominous mingling of restraint and resentment. Nothing daunted, however, he went on. "Couldn't we shake all that?" The look of wonder returned. "Shake all that?" she repeated. "I do not understand." "Well, I'm not positively aching to see cows, and you must be sick of showing them. I think, too, I've about sized the whole show. Wouldn't it be better if we sat down in that arbor, supposing it won't fall down, and you told me all about the lot? It would save you a heap of trouble, and keep your pretty frock cleaner than traipsing around. Of course," he said, with a quick transition to the gentlest courtesy, "if you're conscientious about this thing, we'll go on and not spare a cow. Consider me in it with you for the whole morning." She looked at him again, and then suddenly broke into a charming laugh. It revealed a set of strong white teeth, as well as a certain barbaric trace in its cadence which civilized restraint had not entirely overlaid. "I suppose she really is a peasant, in spite of that pretty frock," he said to himself, as he laughed too. But her face presently took a shade of reserve, and with a gentle but singular significance she said, "I think you must see the dairy." Hoffman's hat was in his hand with a vivacity that tumbled the brown curls on his forehead. "By all means," he said instantly, and began walking by her side in modest but easy silence. Now that he thought her a conscientious peasant, he was quiet and respectful. Presently she lifted her eyes, which, despite her gravity, had not entirely lost their previous mirthfulness, and said, "But you Americans, in your rich and prosperous country, with your large lands and your great harvest, you must know all about farming." "Never was in a dairy in my life," said Hoffman gravely. "I'm from the city of New York, where the cows give swill milk and are kept in cellars." Her eyebrows contracted prettily in an effort to understand. Then she apparently gave it up, and said with a slanting glint of mischief in her eyes, "Then you come here like the other Americans in hope to see the Grand Duke and Duchess and the princesses?" "No. The fact is I almost tumbled into a lot of 'em, standing like wax figures, the other side of the Park Lodge the other day, and got away as soon as I could. I think I prefer the cows." Her head was slightly turned away. He had to content himself with looking down upon the strong feet in their serviceable but smartly buckled shoes that uplifted her upright figure as she moved beside him. "Of course," he added with boyish but unmistakable courtesy, "if it's part of your show to trot out the family, why, I'm in that, too. I dare say you could make them interesting." "But why?" she said, with her head still slightly turned away toward a figure, a sturdy-looking woman, which for the first time Hoffman perceived was walking in a line with them as the chasseur had done. "Why did you come here at all?" "The first time was a fool accident," he returned frankly. "I was making a short cut through what I thought was a public park. The second time was because I had been rude to a police inspector, whom I found going through my things, but who apologized, as I suppose, by getting me an invitation from the Grand Duke to come here, and I thought it only the square thing to both of 'em to accept it. But I'm mighty glad I came. I wouldn't have missed you for $1,000. You see, I haven't struck anyone I cared to talk to since." Here he suddenly remarked that she hadn't looked at him, and that the delicate whiteness of her neck was quite suffused with pink, and stopped instantly. Presently he said quite easily, "Who's the chorus?" "The lady?" "Yes, she's watching us as if she didn't quite approve, you know, just as if she didn't catch on." "She's the head housekeeper of the farm. Perhaps you would prefer to have her show you the dairy. Shall I call her?" The figure in question was very short and stout, with voluminous petticoats. "Please don't. I'll stay without your setting that paperweight on me. But here's the dairy. Don't let her come inside among those pans of fresh milk with that smile, or there'll be trouble." The young girl paused too, made a slight gesture with her hand, and the figure passed on as they entered the dairy. It was beautifully clean and fresh, with a persistence that he quickly recognized as mischievous and ironical, and, with his characteristic adaptability, accepted with even greater gravity and assumption of interest. She showed him all the details. From thence they passed to the farmyard, where he hung with breathless attention over the names of the cows, and made her repeat them. Although she was evidently familiar with the subject, he could see that her zeal was fitful and impatient. "Suppose we sit down," he said, pointing to an ostentatious rustic seat in the center of the green. "Sit down?" she repeated wonderingly. "What for?" "To talk. We'll knock off and call it half a day." "But if you are not looking at the farm, you are, of course, going," she said quickly. "Am I? I don't think these particulars were in my invitation." She again broke into a fit of laughter, and at the same time cast a bright eye around the field. "Come," he said gently, "there are no other sightseers waiting, and your conscience is clear," and he moved toward the rustic seat. "Certainly not there," she added in a low voice. They moved on slowly together to a copse of willows which overhung the miniature stream. "You are not staying long in Alstadt?" she said. "No, I only came to see the old town that my ancestors came from." They were walking so close together that her skirt brushed his trousers, but she suddenly drew away from him, and looking him fixedly in the eye, said, "Ah, you have relations here?" "Yes, but they are dead 200 years." She laughed again with a slight expression of relief. They had entered the copse and were walking in dense shadow when she suddenly stopped and sat down upon a rustic bench. To his surprise, he found that they were quite alone. "Tell me about these relatives," she said, slightly drawing aside her skirt to make room for him on the seat. He did not require a second invitation. He not only told her all about his ancestral progenitors, but, I fear, even about those more recent and more nearly related to him. About his own life, his vocation — he was a clever newspaper correspondent with a roving commission — his ambitions, his beliefs, and his romance. "And then, perhaps, of this visit, you will also make copy?" He smiled at her quick adaptation of his professional slang, but shook his head. "No," he said gravely. "No, this is you. The Chicago Interviewer is big pay and is rich, but it hasn't capital enough to buy you from me." He gently slid his hand toward hers and slipped his fingers softly around it. She made a slight movement of withdrawal, but even then, as if in forgetfulness or indifference, permitted her hand to rest unresponsively in his. It was scarcely an encouragement to gallantry, neither was it a rejection of an unconscious familiarity. "But you haven't told me about yourself," he said. "Oh, I?" she returned, with her first approach to coquetry in a laugh and sidelong glance. "Of what importance is that to you? Is it the Grand Duchess and Her Highness, the Princess, that you Americans seek to know? I am what I am, as you see." "You bet," said Hoffman with charming decision. "I what?" "You are, you know, and that's good enough for me. But I don't even know your name." She laughed again, and after a pause said, "Elsbeth." "But I couldn't call you by your first name on our first meeting, you know." "Then you Americans are really so formal, eh?" she said slyly, looking at her imprisoned hand. "Well, yes," returned Hoffman, disengaging it. "I suppose we are respectful, or mean to be. But whom am I to inquire for, to write to?" "You are neither to write nor inquire." "What?" She had moved in her seat so as to half face him, with eyes in which curiosity, mischief, and a certain seriousness alternated, but for the first time seemed conscious of his hand, and accented her words with a slight pressure. "You are to return to your hotel presently, and say to your landlord, 'Pack up my luggage. I have finished with this old town and my ancestors and the Grand Duke, whom I do not care to see, and I shall leave Alstadt tomorrow.'" "Thank you. I don't catch on." "Of what necessity should you? I have said it. That should be enough for a chivalrous American like you." She again significantly looked down at her hand. "If you mean that you know the extent of the favor you ask me, I can say no more," he said seriously. "But give me some reason for it." "Ah, so," she said with a slight shrug of her shoulders. "Then I must tell you. You say you do not know the Grand Duke and Duchess. Well, they know you. The day before yesterday you were wandering in the park, as you admit. You say also you got through the hedge and interrupted some ceremony. That ceremony was not a court function, Mr. Hoffman, but something equally sacred, the photographing of the ducal family before the Schloss. You say that you instantly withdrew, but after the photograph was taken, the plate revealed a stranger standing actually by the side of the Princess Alexandrine, and even taking the pas of the Grand Duke himself. That stranger was you." "And the picture was spoiled," said the American, with a quiet laugh. "I should not say that," returned the lady, with a demure glance at her companion's handsome face. "And I do not believe that the Princess, who first saw the photograph, thought so either. But she is very young and wilful, and has the reputation of being very indiscreet, and unfortunately she begged the photographer not to destroy the plate, but to give it to her, and to say nothing about it, except that the plate was defective, and to take another. Still, it would have ended there if her curiosity had not led her to confide a description of the stranger to the police inspector, with the result you know." "Then I am expected to leave town because I accidentally stumbled into a family group that was being photographed?" "Because a certain princess was indiscreet enough to show her curiosity about you," corrected the fair stranger. "But look here, I'll apologize to the princess, and offer to pay for the plate." "Then you do want to see the princess?" said the young girl, smiling. "You are like the others." "Bother the princess! I want to see you, and I don't see how they can prevent it if I choose to remain." "Very easily. You will find that there is something wrong with your passport, and you will be sent on to Pumpernickel for examination. You will unwittingly transgress some of the laws of the town, and be ordered to leave it. You will be shadowed by the police until you quarrel with them, like a free American, and you are conducted to the frontier. Perhaps you will strike an officer who has insulted you, and then you are finished on the spot." The American's crest rose palpably until it cocked his straw hat over his curls. "Suppose I am content to risk it, having first laid the whole matter and its trivial cause before the American minister, so that he could make it hot for this whole caboodle of a country if they happened to down me. By Jove, I shouldn't mind being the martyr of an international episode if they'd spare me long enough to let me get the first copy over to the other side." His eyes sparkled. "You could expose them, but they would then deny the whole story, and you have no evidence. They would demand to know your informant, and I should be disgraced, and the princess, who is already talked about, made a subject of a scandal. But no matter. It is right that an American's independence shall not be interfered with." She raised the hem of her handkerchief to her blue eyes and slightly turned her head aside. Hoffman gently drew the handkerchief away, and in so doing possessed himself of her other hand. "Look here, Miss Elsbeth, you know I wouldn't give you away, whatever happened. But couldn't I get hold of that photographer? I saw him. He wanted me to sit to him, and make him tell me." "He wanted you to sit to him?" she said hurriedly. "And did you?" "No," he replied. "He was a little too fresh and previous, though I thought he fancied some resemblance in me to somebody else." "Ah!" She said something to herself in German, which he did not understand, and then added aloud, "You did well. He is a bad man, this photographer. Promise me you shall not sit for him." "How can I if I'm fired out of the place like this?" he added ruefully. "But I'd like to make him give himself away to me somehow." "He will not, and if he did, he would deny it afterward. Do not go near him nor see him. Be careful that he does not photograph you with his instantaneous instrument when you are passing. Now you must go. I must see the princess." "Let me go too. I will explain it to her," said Hoffman. She stopped, looked at him keenly, and attempted to withdraw her hands. "Ah, then it is so! It is the princess you wish to see. You are curious, you too. You wish to see this lady who is interested in you. I ought to have known it. You are all alike." He met her gaze with laughing frankness, accepting her outburst as a charming feminine weakness, half jealousy, half coquetry, but restrained her hands. "Nonsense," he said. "I wish to see her that I may have the right to see you, that you shall not lose your place here through me, that I may come again." "You must never come here again." "Then you must come where I am. We will meet somewhere when you have an afternoon off. You shall show me the town. The houses of my ancestors, their tombs, possibly. If the Grand Duke rampages, the probable site of my own." She looked into his laughing eyes with her clear, steadfast, gravely questioning blue ones. "Do not you Americans know that it is not the fashion here in Germany for the young men and the young women to walk together unless they are verlobt?" "Fair which?" "Engaged." She nodded her head thrice, viciously, decidedly, mischievously. "So much the better." "Ach Gott!" She made a gesture of hopelessness at his incorrigibility, and again attempted to withdraw her hands. "I must go now." "Well, then, good-bye." It was easy to draw her closer by simply lowering her still captive hands. Then he suddenly kissed her coldly startled lips, and instantly released her. She as instantly vanished. "Elsbeth!" he called quickly. "Elsbeth!" Her now really frightened face reappeared with a heightened color from the dense foliage, quite to his astonishment. "Hush!" she said, with her finger on her lips. "Are you mad?" "I only wanted to remind you to square me with the Princess," he laughed, as her head disappeared. He strolled back toward the gate. Scarcely had he quitted the shrubbery before the same chasseur made his appearance with precisely the same salute, and, keeping exactly the same distance, accompanied him to the gate. At the corner of the street he hailed a droschky and was driven to his hotel. The landlord came up smiling. He trusted that the Herr had greatly enjoyed himself at the Schloss. It was a distinguished honor, in fact, quite unprecedented. Hoffmann, while he determined not to commit himself, nor his late fair companion, was nevertheless anxious to learn something more of her relations to the Schloss. So pretty, so characteristic, and marked a figure must be well known to sightseers. Indeed, once or twice the idea had crossed his mind with a slightly jealous twinge that left him more conscious of the impression she had made on him than he had deemed possible. He asked if the model farm and dairy were always shown by the same attendants. Ach Gott, no doubt yes. His Royal Highness had quite a retinue when he was in residence. And were these attendants in costume? There was undoubtedly a livery for the servants. Hoffmann felt a slight republican irritation at the epithet. He knew not why. But this costume was rather a historical one. Surely it was not entrusted to everyday menials, and he briefly described it. His host's blank curiosity suddenly changed to a look of mysterious and arch intelligence. Ach Gott, yes! He remembered now, with his finger on his nose, that when there was a fest at the Schloss, the farm and dairy were filled with shepherdesses, in quaint costume worn by the ladies of the Grand Duke's own theatrical company, who assumed the characters with great vivacity. Surely it was the same, and the Grand Duke had treated the Herr to this special courtesy. Yes, there was one pretty blonde young lady, the Fräulein Wimpfenbuttel, a most popular soubrette, who would play it to the life, and the description fitted her to a hair. Ah, there was no doubt of it. Many persons, indeed, had been so deceived. But happily, now that he had given him the wink, the Herr could corroborate it himself by going to the theater tonight.
Ah, it would be a great joke, quite colossal, if he took a front seat where she could see him. And the good man rubbed his hands in gleeful anticipation. Hoffmann had listened to him with a slow repugnance that was only equal to his gradual conviction that the explanation was a true one, and that he himself had been ridiculously deceived. The mystery of his fair companion's costume, which he had accepted as part of the show, the inconsistency of her manner and her evident occupation, her undeniable wish to terminate the whole episode with that single interview, her mingling of worldly aplomb and rustic innocence, her perfect self-control and experienced acceptance of his gallantry under the simulated attitude of simplicity, all now struck him as perfectly comprehensible. He recalled the actress's inimitable touch in certain picturesque, realistic details in the dairy, which she had not spared him. He recognized it now even in their bowered confidences, how like a pretty ballet scene their whole interview on the rustic bench was. And it breathed through their entire conversation, to their theatrical parting at the close, and the whole story of the photograph was, no doubt, as pure a dramatic invention as the rest. The princess's romantic interest in him, that princess who had never appeared,
why had he not detected the old, well-worn, sentimental situation here? Was all a part of it. The dark, mysterious hint of his persecution by the police was a necessary culmination to the little farce. Thank heaven, he had not risen at the princess, even if he had given himself away to the clever actress in her own humble role. Then the humor of the whole situation predominated, and he laughed until the tears came to his eyes, and his forgotten ancestors might have turned over in their graves without his heeding them. And with this humanizing influence upon him, he went to the theater. It was a capacious event for the town, and although the performance was a special one, he had no difficulty in getting a whole box to himself. He tried to avoid this public isolation by sitting close to the next box, where there was a solitary occupant, an officer, apparently as lonely as himself. He had made up his mind that when his fair deceiver appeared, he would let her see by his significant applause that he recognized her, but bore no malice for the trick she had played on him. After all, he had kissed her. He had no right to complain. If she should recognize him, and this recognition led to a withdrawal of her prohibition and their better acquaintance, he would be a fool to cavil at her pleasant artifice. Her vocation was certainly a more independent and original one than that he had supposed. For its social quality and inequality he cared nothing. He found himself longing for the glance of her calm blue eyes, for the pleasant smile that broke the seriousness of her sweetly restrained lips. There was no doubt that he should know her even as the heroine of Der Czar und der Zimmermann on the bill before him. He was becoming impatient, and the performance evidently was waiting. A stir in the outer gallery, the clatter of sabers, the filing of uniforms into the royal box, and a triumphant burst from the orchestra showed the cause. As a few ladies and gentlemen in full evening dress emerged from the background of uniforms and took their places in the front of the box, Hoffmann looked with some interest for the romantic princess. Suddenly he saw a face and shoulders in a glitter of diamonds that startled him, and then a glance that transfixed him. He leaned over to his neighbor. "Who is the young lady in the box?" "The Princess Alexandrina." "I mean the young lady in the blue with blonde hair and blue eyes." "It is the Princess Alexandrina Elsbeth Marie Stephanie, the daughter of the Grand Duke. There is none other there." "Thank you." He sat quietly looking at the rising curtain and the stage. Then he rose quietly, gathered his hat and coat, and left the box. When he reached the gallery, he turned instinctively and looked back at the royal box. Her eyes had followed him, and as he remained a moment motionless in the doorway, her lips parted in a grateful smile, and she waved her fan with a faint but unmistakable gesture of farewell. The next morning he left Alstadt. There was some little delay at the Zoll on the frontier, and when Hoffmann received back his trunk, it was accompanied by a little sealed packet, which was handed to him by the custom-house inspector. Hoffmann did not open it until he was alone. There hangs upon the wall of his modest apartment in New York a narrow, irregular photograph, ingeniously framed, of himself standing side by side with a young German girl, who, in the estimation of his compatriots, is by no means stylish, and only passably good-looking. When he is joked by his friends about the post of honor given to this production, and questioned as to the lady, he remains silent. The Princess Alexandrina Elsbeth Marie Stephanie von Westphalen-Altstadt, among her other royal qualities, knew whom to trust. End of
The Devotion of Enriquez, Part 1, from Selected Stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The present recording is by Raju, Ramina45@hotmail.com. The Devotion of Enriquez by Bret Harte, Part 1. In another chronicle which dealt with the exploits of Shushu, a Californian mustang. I gave some space to the accomplishments of Enrique Saltillo, who assisted me in training her and who was also brother of Consuelo Saltillo, the young lady, to whom I had freely given both the mustang and my youthful affections. I consider it a proof of the superiority of masculine friendship that neither the subsequent desertion of the mustang nor that of the young lady ever made the slightest difference to Enrique or me in our exalted amity. To a wondering doubt as to what I ever could possibly have seen in his sister to admire, he joined a tolerant skepticism of the whole sex. This he was wont to express in the marvelous combination of Spanish precision and California slang, for which he was justly famous. As to these women and their little game, he would say, "Believe me, my friend, your old uncle Henry is not in it. No, he will ever take a back seat when Loaf is around. For why? Regard me here. If she is a horse, you shall say, she will buck jump. She will shy, she will not arrive, or she will arrive too quick. But if it is these women, where are you? For when you shall say, she will shy, look you, she will walk straight, or she will remain tranquil when you think she buck jump, or else she will arrive, and look you, you will not. You shall get left. It is ever so. My father and the brother of my father have both made court to my mother when she was but a senorita. My father think she have loved his mother more. So he say to her, "It is enough. Tranquilize yourself. I will go. I will efface myself. Adios. Shake hands. Tata. So long. See you again in the fall." And what make my mother? Regard me. She married my father on the instant. Of these women, believe me, Pancho, you shall know nothing, not even if they shall make you the son of your father or his nephew. I have recalled this characteristic speech to show the general tendency of Enrique's convictions of the opening of this little story. It is only fair to say, however, that his usual attitude toward the sex he so cheerfully maligned exhibited little apprehension or caution in dealing with them. Among the frivolous and light-minded intermixture of his race, he moved with great freedom and popularity. He danced well. When we went to fandangos together, his agility and audacity of his figures always procured him the prettiest partners. His professed sentiments, I presume, shielding him from subsequent jealousies, heart-burnings, or envy. I have a vivid recollection of him in the mysteries of the semiquaqua, a somewhat corybantic dance, which left much to the invention of the performers and very little to the imagination of the spectator. In one of the figures, a gaudy handkerchief waved more or less gracefully by dancer and danseuse before the dazzled eyes of each other acted as a love signal and was used to express alternate admiration and indifference, shyness and audacity, fear and transport, coyness and coquetry as the dance proceeded. I need not say that Enrique's pantomimic illustration of these emotions was peculiarly extravagant, but it was always performed and accepted with a gravity that was an essential feature of the dance. At such times, sighs would escape him which were supposed to portray the incipient stages of passion, snorts of jealousy burst from him at the suggestion of a rival. He was overtaken by a sort of Saint Vitus dance that expressed his timidity in making the first advances of affection. The scorn of his lady love struck with him with something like a dumb awe, and a single gesture of invitation from her produced marked delirium. All this was very like Enrique, but on the particular occasion to which I refer, I think no one was prepared to see him begin the figure with the waving of 4 handkerchiefs. Yet this he did, pirouetting, capering, brandishing his silken signals like a ballerina's scarf in the languishment or fire of passion, until in a final figure, where the conquered and submitting fair one usually sinks into the arms of her partner, need it be said that ingenious Enrique was found in the center of the floor supporting 4 of the dancers. Yet he was by no means unduly excited either by the plaudits of the crowd or by his evident success in the fair. "Ah, believe me, it's nothing," he said quietly, rolling a fresh cigarette as he leaned against the doorway. "Possibly I shall have to offer the chocolate or the wine to these girls, or make them a promenade in the moonlight on the veranda. It is ever so, unless, my friend, he said, suddenly turning toward me in an excess of chivalrous self-abnegation, unless you shall yourself take my place. Behold, I give them to you. I vamos, I vanish, I make track, I skedaddle. I think he would have carried his extravagance to the point of summoning his 4 gypsy witches of partners and committing them to my care, if the crowd had not at that moment parted before the remaining dancers and left one of the onlookers, a tall, slender girl, calmly surveying them through gold-rimmed eyeglasses in complete critical absorption. I stared in amazement and consternation, for I recognized in the fair stranger Miss Urania Mannersley, the Congregational minister's niece. Everybody knew Rainey Mannersley throughout the length and breadth of the Encinal. She was at once the envy and the good of the daughters of those southwestern and eastern immigrants who had settled in the valley. She was correct, she was critical, she was faultless and observant. She was proper yet independent. She was highly educated. She was suspected of knowing Latin and Greek. She even spelled correctly. She could wither the plainest field nosegay in the hands of other girls by giving the flowers their botanical names. She never said, "Ain't you?" but "Aren't you?" She looked upon "Did I which?" as an incomplete and imperfect form of "What did I do?" She quoted from Browning and Tennyson and was believed to have read them. She was from Boston. What could she possibly be doing at a free and easy fandango? Even if these facts were not already familiar to everyone there, her outward appearance would have attracted attention. Contrasted with the gorgeous red, black, and yellow skirts of the dancers, her plain, tightly fitting gown and hat, all of one delicate grey, were sufficiently notable in themselves, even had they not seemed, like the girl herself, a kind of quiet protest to the glaring flounces before her. Her small straight waist and flat back brought into greater relief the corsetless, waistless, swaying figures of the Mexican girls, and her long, slim, well-booted feet, peeping from the stiff white edges of her short skirt, made their broad, low-quartered slippers, held on by the big toe, appear more preposterous than ever. Suddenly she seemed to realize that she was standing there alone, but without fear or embarrassment. As she drew back a little, glancing carelessly behind her as if missing some previous companion, and then her eyes fell upon mine, she smiled an easy recognition. Then a moment later her glance rested more curiously upon Enrique, who was still by my side. I disengaged myself and instantly joined her, particularly as I noticed that a few of the other bystanders were beginning to stare at her with little reserve. "Isn't it the most extraordinary thing you ever saw?" she said quietly. Then, presently noticing the look of embarrassment on my face, she went on more by way of conversation than of explanation. "I just left Uncle making a call on a parishioner next door, and was going home with Jocasta, a peon servant of her uncle's, when I heard the music and dropped in. I don't know what has become of her," she added, glancing round the room again. "She seemed perfectly wild when she saw that creature over there bounding about with his handkerchiefs. You were speaking to him just now. Do tell me, is he real?" "I should think there was little doubt of that," I said with a vague laugh. "You know what I mean," she said simply. "Is he quite sane? Does he do that because he likes it, or is he paid for it?" This was too much. I pointed out, somewhat hurriedly, that he was a scion of one of the oldest Castilian families, that the performance was a national gypsy dance, which he had joined in as a patriot and a patron, and that he was my dearest friend. At the same time, I was conscious that I wished she hadn't seen his last performance. "You don't mean to say that all that he did was in the dance?" she said. "I don't believe it. It was only like him." As I hesitated over this palpable truth, she went on, "I do wish he would do it again. Don't you think you could make him?" "Perhaps he might if you asked him," I said a little maliciously. "Of course I shouldn't do that," she returned quietly. "All the same, I do believe he is really going to do it, or something else. Do look." I looked and to my horror saw that Enrique, possibly incited by the delicate gold eyeglasses of Miss Mannersley, had divested himself of his coat and was winding the 4 handkerchiefs tied together picturesquely around his waist, preparatory to some new performance. I tried furtively to give him a warning look, but in vain. "Isn't he really too absurd for anything?" said Miss Mannersley, yet with a certain comfortable anticipation in her voice. "You know, I never saw anything like this before. I wouldn't have believed such a creature could have existed. Even had I succeeded in warning him, I doubt if it would have been any avail, for, seizing a guitar from one of the musicians, he struck a few chords and suddenly began to zigzag into the center of the floor, swaying his body languishingly from side to side in time with the music and the pitch of a thin Spanish tenor. It was a gypsy love song. Possibly Miss Mannersley's lingual accomplishments did not include a knowledge of Castilian, but she could not fail to see that the gestures and illustrative pantomime were addressed to her, passionately assuring her that she was the most favored daughter of the Virgin, that her eyes were like votive tapers, and yet in the same breath accusing her being a brigand and assassin in her attitude toward his heart. He balanced with quivering timidity toward her, threw in imaginary cloak in front of her neat boots as a carpet for her to tread on, and with a final astonishing pirouette and languishing twang of his guitar, sank on one knee and blew with a rose a kiss at her feet. If I had been seriously angry with him before for his grotesque extravagance, I could have pitied him now for the young girl's absolute unconsciousness of anything but his utter ludicrousness. The applause of dancers and bystanders was instantaneous and hearty. Her only contribution to it was a slight parting of her thin red lips in a half-incredulous smile. In the silence that followed the applause, as Enrique walked pantingly away, I heard her saying half to herself, "Certainly a most extraordinary creature." In my indignation, I could not help turning suddenly upon her and looking straight into her eyes. They were brown, with that peculiar velvet opacity common to the pupils of near-sighted persons, and seemed to defy internal scrutiny. She only repeated carelessly, "Isn't he?" and added, "Please see if you can find Jocasta. I suppose we ought to be going now, and I dare say he won't be doing it again. Ah, there she is. Good gracious! Child, what have you got there?" It was Enrique's rose, which Jocasta had picked up, and was timidly holding out toward her mistress. "Heavens, I don't want it. Keep it yourself." I walked with them to the door, as I did not fancy a certain glitter in the black eyes of the senoritas Manuela and Pepita, who were watching her curiously. But I think she was as oblivious of this as she was of Enrique's peculiar attentions. As we reached the street, I felt that I ought to say something more. "You know," I began casually, "that although those poor people meet here in this public way, their gathering is really quite a homely pastoral and a national custom, and these girls are all honest, hard-working peons or servants enjoying themselves in quite the old idyllic fashion." "Certainly," said the young girl half abstractedly. "Of course it is a Moorish dance, originally brought over, I suppose, by those old Andalusian immigrants 200 years ago. It's quite Arabic in its suggestions. I have got something like it in an old cancionero I picked up at a bookstall in Boston. But," she added with a gasp of reminiscent satisfaction, "that's not like him." "Oh, no, he is decidedly original. Heavens, yes." I turned away in some discomfiture to join Enrique, who was calmly awaiting me with a cigarette in his mouth outside the sala. Yet he looked so unconscious of any previous absurdity that I hesitated in what I thought was a necessary warning. He, however, quickly precipitated it. Glancing after the retreating figures of the two women, he said, This Miss from Boston is returned to her house. You do not accompany her? I shall. Behold me. I am there. But I linked my arm firmly in his. Then I pointed out, first, that she was already accompanied by a servant. Secondly, that if I, who knew her, had hesitated to offer myself as an escort, it was hardly proper for him, a perfect stranger, to take that liberty. That Miss Mannersley was very punctilious of etiquette, which he as a Castilian gentleman ought to appreciate. But will she not regard love, the admiration excessive? He said, twirling his thin little moustache meditatively. No, she will not, I returned sharply, and you ought to understand that she is on a different level from your Manuelas and Carmens. Pardon, my friend, he said gravely. These women are ever the same. There is a proverb in my language. Listen. Whether the short blade of the Toledo pierce the satin or the goat skin, it shall find behind it ever the same heart to wound. I am the Toledo blade. Possibly it is you, my friend. Wherefore, let us together pursue this girl of Boston on the instant. But I kept my grasp on Enriquez's arm and succeeded in restraining his mercurial impulses for the moment. He halted and puffed vigorously at his cigarette, but the next instant he started forward again. Let us, however, follow with discretion in the rear. We shall pass her house. We shall gaze at it. It shall touch her heart. Ridiculous as was this following of the young girl we had only just parted from, I nevertheless knew that Enrique was quite capable of attempting it alone, and I thought it better to humor him by consenting to walk with him in that direction, but I felt it necessary to say, I ought to warn you that Miss Mannersley already looks upon your performances at the Sala as something outer and peculiar, and if I were you, I shouldn't do anything to deepen that impression. You are saying she is shocked, said Enrique gravely. I felt I could not consciously say that she was shocked, and he saw my hesitation. Then she have jealousy of the senoritas, he observed, with insufferable complacency. You observe, I have already said it is ever so. I could stand it no longer. Look here, Harry, I said, if you must know it, she looks upon you as an acrobat, a paid performer. Ah, his black eyes sparkled. The torero, the man who fights the bull, he is also an acrobat. Yes, but she thinks you a clown, a gracisco di teatro. Then I have make her laugh, he said coolly. I don't think he had, but I shrugged my shoulders. You know, he said cheerfully. Look, he began with a laugh, he may finish with a sigh. I turned to look at him in the moonlight. His face presented its habitual Spanish gravity, a gravity that was almost ironical. His small black eyes had their characteristic irresponsible audacity, the irresponsibility of the vivacious young animal. It could not be possible that he was really touched with the placid frigidities of Miss Mannersley. I remembered his equally elastic gallantries with Miss Pinky Smith, a blonde Western belle, from which both had harmlessly rebounded. As we walked on slowly, I continued more persuasively. Of course, this is only your nonsense, but don't you see, Miss Mannersley thinks it all in earnest and really your nature. I hesitated, for it suddenly struck me that it was really his nature. And hang it all, you don't want her to believe you a common buffoon or some intoxicated muchacho. Intoxicated? Repeated Enrique with exasperating languishment. Yes, that's the word that shall express itself. My friend, you have made a shot in the center. You have ring the bell every time. It is intoxication, but not aguardiente. Look, I have long time an ancestor of whom is a pretty story. One day in church he have seen a young girl, a mere peasant girl, pass to the confessional. He look her in her eye. He stagger. Here Enrique wobbled pantomimically into the road. he fall. He would have suited the action to the word if I had not firmly held him up. They have taken him home, where he have remained without his clothes, and have dance and sing. But it was the drunkenness of loaf. And look you, this village girl was nothing, not even pretty. The name of my ancestor was Don Quixote de la Mancha, I suggested maliciously. I suspected as much. Come along, that will do. My ancestor's name, continued Enrique gravely, was Antonio Hermenegildo de Salvatierra, which is not the same. These Don Quixote of whom you speak exist not at all. Never mind. Only, for heaven's sake, as we are nearing the house, don't make a fool of yourself again. It was a wonderful moonlight night. The deep redwood porch of the Mannersley parsonage, under the shadow of a great oak, the largest in the Encinal, was diapered in black and silver. As the women stepped upon the porch, their shadows were silhouetted against the door. Miss Mannersley paused for an instant and turned to give a last look at the beauty of the night as Jocasta entered. Her glance fell upon us as we passed. She nodded carelessly and unaffectedly to me, but as she recognized Enrique, she looked a little longer at him with her previous cold and invincible curiosity. To my horror, Enrique began instantly to affect a slight tremulousness of gait and a difficulty of breathing, but I gripped his arm savagely and managed to get him past the house as the door closed finally on the young lady. You do not comprehend, friend Pancho, he said gravely, but those eyes in their glass are as the Espejo story of the burning mirror. They burn, they consume me here like paper. Let's affix to ourselves these three. She will without doubt appear at her window. We shall salute her for good night. We'll do nothing of the kind, I said sharply. Finding that I was determined, he permitted me to lead him away. I was delighted to notice, however, that he had indicated the window which I knew was the minister's study, and that as the bedrooms were in the rear of the house, this later incident was probably not overseen by the young lady or the servant. But I did not part from Enrique as I saw him safely back to the sala, where I left him sipping chocolate, his arm alternating around the waists of his two previous partners in a delightful Arcadian and childlike simplicity and an apparent utter forgetfulness of Miss Mannersley. The fandangos were usually held on Saturday night, and the next day being Sunday, I missed Enrique, but as he was a devout Catholic, I remembered that he was at Mass in the morning and possibly at the bullfight at San Antonio in the afternoon. But I was somewhat surprised on the Monday morning following, as I was crossing the plaza, to have my arm taken by the Reverend Mr. Mannersley in the nearest approach to familiarity that was consistent with the reserve of this eminent divine. I looked at him inquiringly. Although scrupulously correct in attire, his features always had a singular resemblance to the national caricature known as Uncle Sam, but with the humorous expression left out. Softly stroking his goatee with 3 fingers, he began condescendingly, "You are, I think, more or less familiar with the characteristics and customs of the Spanish as exhibited by the settlers here." A thrill of apprehension went through me. Had he heard of Enrique's proceedings? Had Miss Mannersley cruelly betrayed him to her uncle? I have not given that attention myself to their language and social peculiarities, he continued with a large wave of the hand, being much occupied with the study of their religious beliefs and superstitions. It struck me that this was apt to be a common fault of people of the Mannersley type, but I have refrained from a personal discussion of them. On the contrary, I have held somewhat broad views on the subject of their remarkable missionary work and have suggested a scheme of cooperation with them, quite independent of doctrinal teaching, to my brethren of other Protestant Christian sects. These views I first incorporated in a sermon last Sunday week, which I am told has created considerable attention. He stopped and coughed slightly. I have not heard from any of the Roman clergy, but I am led to believe that my remarks were not ungrateful to Catholics generally. I was relieved, although still in some wonder why he should address me on this topic. I had a vague remembrance of having heard that he had said something on Sunday which had offended some Puritans of his flock, but nothing more. He continued, "I have just said that I was unacquainted with the characteristics of the Spanish-American race. I presume, however, they have the impulsiveness of their Latin origin. They gesticulate, they express their gratitude, their joy, their affection, their emotions generally by spasmodic movements. They naturally dance, sing, A horrible suspicion crossed my mind. I could only stare helplessly at him. "I see," he said graciously. "Perhaps it is a somewhat general question. I will explain myself. A rather similar occurrence happened to me the other night. I had returned from visiting a parishioner and was alone in my study reviewing my sermon for the next day. It must have been quite late before I concluded, for I distinctly remember my niece had returned with her servant fully an hour before. Presently I heard the sounds of a musical instrument in the road, with the accents of someone singing or rehearsing some metrical composition in words that, although couched in a language foreign to me, in expression and modulation gave me the impression of being distinctly adulatory. For some little time, in the greater preoccupation of my task, I paid little attention to the performance, but its persistency at length drew me in no more idle curiosity to the window. From thence, standing in my dressing gown, and believing myself unperceived, I noticed under the large oak in the roadside the figure of a young man, who by the imperfect light appeared to be of Spanish extraction. But I evidently miscalculated my own invisibility, for he moved rapidly forward as I came to the window, and in a series of the most extraordinary pantomimic gestures saluted me. Beyond my experience of a few Greek plays in earlier days, I confess I am not an adept in the understanding of gesticulation, but it struck me that the various phases of gratitude, fervor, reverence, and exaltation were successively portrayed. He placed his hands upon his head, his heart, and even clasped them together in this manner. To my consternation, the reverend gentleman here imitated Enriquez's most extravagant pantomime. "I am willing to confess," he continued, "that I was singularly moved by them, as well as by the highly creditable and Christian interest that evidently produced them. At last I opened the window. Leaning out, I told him that I regretted that the lateness of the hour prevented any further response from me than a grateful, though hurried acknowledgment of his praiseworthy emotion, but that I should be glad to see him for a few moments in the vestry before service the next day, or at early candlelight before the meeting of the Bible class. I told him that as my sole purpose had been the creation of an evangelical brotherhood and the exclusion of merely doctrinal views, nothing could be more gratifying to me than his spontaneous and unsolicited testimony to my motives. He appeared for an instant to be deeply affected and indeed quite overcome with emotion, and then gracefully retired with some agility and slight saltatory movement. He passed. A sudden and overwhelming idea took possession of me, and I looked impulsively into his face. Was it possible that for once Enriquez's ironical extravagance had been understood, met, and vanquished by a master hand? But the Reverend Mr. Mannersley's self-satisfied face betrayed no ambiguity or lurking humor. He was evidently in earnest. He had complacently accepted for himself the abandoned Enriquez serenade to his niece. I felt a hysterical desire to laugh, but it was checked by my companion's next words. I informed my niece of the occurrence in the morning at breakfast. She had not heard anything of the strange performance, but she agreed with me as to its undoubted origin in a grateful recognition of my liberal efforts toward his co-religionists. It was she, in fact, who suggested that your knowledge of these people might corroborate my impressions. I was dumbfounded. Had Miss Mannersley, who must have recognized Enrique's hand in this, concealed the fact in a desire to shield him? But this was so inconsistent with her utter indifference to him, except as a grotesque study, that she would have been more likely to tell her uncle all about his previous performance. Nor could it be that she wished to conceal her visit to the fandango. She was far too independent for that, and it was even possible that the reverend gentleman, in his desire to know more of Enrique's compatriots, would not have objected. In my confusion, I meekly added my conviction to hers, congratulated him upon his evident success, and slipped away. But I was burning with a desire to see Enrique and know all. He was imaginative but not untruthful. Unfortunately, I learned that he was just then following one of his erratic impulses, and had gone to a rodeo at his cousin's in the foothills, where he was alternately exercising his horsemanship in catching and breaking wild cattle and delighting his relatives with his incomparable grasp of the American language and customs, and of the airs of a young man of fashion. Then my thoughts recurred to Miss Mannersley. Had she really been oblivious that night to Enrique's serenade? I resolved to find out, if I could, without betraying Enrique. Indeed, it was possible, after all, that it might not have been he. End of part 1 of the Devotion of Enriquez from Selected. The Devotion of Enriquez, Part 2, from Selected Stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The present recording is by Raju, Ramina45@hotmail.com. The Devotion of Enriquez, Part 2. Chance favored me. The next evening I was at a party where Miss Mannersley, by reason of her position and quality, was a distinguished, I had almost written a popular, guest. But, as I have formally stated, although the youthful fair of the Encinal were flattered by her casual attentions and secretly admired her superior style and aristocratic calm, they were more or less uneasy under the dominance of her intelligence and education, and were afraid to attempt either confidence or familiarity. They were also singularly jealous of her, for although the average young man was equally afraid of her cleverness and her candor, he was not above paying a tremulous and timid court to her for its effect upon her humbler sisters. This evening she was surrounded by her usual satellites, including, of course, the local notables and special guests of distinction. She had been discussing, I think, the existence of glaciers on Mount Shasta with a spectacled geologist, and had participated with charming frankness in a conversation on anatomy with the local doctor and a learned professor when she was asked to take a seat at the piano. She played with remarkable skill and wonderful precision, but coldly and brilliantly. As she sat there in her subdued but perfectly fitting evening dress, her regular profile and short but slender neck firmly set upon her high shoulders, exhaling an atmosphere of refined puritanism and provocative intelligence, the utter incongruity of Enrique's extravagant attentions, if ironical, and their equal hopelessness, if not, seemed to me plainer than ever. What had this well-poised, coldly observant spinster to do with that quaintly ironic ruffler, the romantic cynic, the rowdy Don Quixote, that impossible Enrique? Presently she ceased playing. Her slim, narrow slipper, revealing her thin ankle, remained upon the pedal. Her delicate fingers were resting idly on the keys. Her head was slightly thrown back, and her narrow eyebrows prettily knit toward the ceiling in an effort of memory. Something of Chopin's, suggested the geologist ardently. That exquisite sonata, pleaded the doctor. Soothing of Rubinstein, heard him once, said a gentleman of Siskiyou.
He just made that piano get up and howl, play Rube. She shook her head with parted lips and a slight touch of girlish coquetry in her manner. Then her fingers suddenly dropped upon the keys with a glassy tinkle. There were a few quick pizzicato chords, down went the low pedal with a monotonous strumming, and she presently began to hum to herself. I started, as well I might, for I recognized one of the Enriquez's favorite and most extravagant guitar solos. It was audacious, it was barbaric, it was, I fear, vulgar. As I remembered it, as he sang it, it recounted the adventures of one Don Francisco, a provincial gallant and roisterer of the most objectionable type. It had 104 verses, which Enrique never spared me. I shuddered as in a pleasant, quiet voice the correct Miss Mannersley warbled in musical praise of Pellejo or wineskin, and a eulogy of the icebox came caressingly from her thin red lips. But the company was far differently affected. The strange, wild air and wilder accompaniment were evidently catching. People moved toward the piano. Somebody whistled the air from a distant corner. Even the faces of geologist and doctor brightened. A Tarantella, I presume, blandly suggested the doctor. Miss Mannersley stopped and rose carelessly from the piano. "It's a Moorish gypsy song of the 15th century," she said dryly. "It seems sort of familiar too," hesitated one of the young men timidly. "Like as if, don't you know?" "You had without knowing it, don't you know?" He blushed slightly. "Sort of picked it up somewhere." "I picked it up, as you call it, in the collection of medieval manuscripts of the Harvard Library and copied it," returned Miss Mannersley coldly as she turned away. But I was not inclined to let her off so easily. I presently made my way to her side. "Your uncle was complimentary enough to consult me as to the meaning of the appearance of a certain exuberant Spanish visitor at his house the other night." I looked into her brown eyes, but my own slipped off her velvety pupils without retaining anything. Then she reinforced her gaze with a pince nez and said carelessly, "Oh, it's you. How are you? Well, could you give him any information?" "Only generally," I returned, still looking into her eyes. "These people are impulsive. The Spanish blood is a mixture of gold and quicksilver." She smiled slightly. "That reminds me of your volatile friend. He was mercurial enough, certainly. Is he still dancing?" "And singing sometimes," I responded pointedly. But she only added casually, "A singular creature," without exhibiting the least consciousness, and drifted away, leaving me none the wiser. I felt that Enrique alone could enlighten me. I must see him. I did, but not in the way I expected. There was a bullfight at San Antonio the next Saturday afternoon, the usual Sunday performance being changed in deference to the sabbatical habits of the Americans. An additional attraction was offered in the shape of a bull and bear fight, also a concession to American taste, which had voted the bullfight slow, and had averred that the bull did not get a fair show. I am glad that I am able to spare the reader the usual realistic horrors, for in the Californian performances there was very little of brutality that distinguished this function in the mother country. The horses were not miserable, worn-out hacks, but young and alert mustangs, and the display of horsemanship by the picadors was not only wonderful, but secured an almost absolute safety to horse and rider. I never saw a horse gored. Although unskillful riders were sometimes thrown in wheeling quickly to avoid the bull's charge, they generally regained their animals without injury. The Plaza de Toros was reached through the decayed and tile-strewn outskirts of an old Spanish village. It was a rudely built oval amphitheater with crumbling, whitewashed adobe walls and roofed only over portions of the gallery reserved for the provincial notables, but now occupied by a few shopkeepers and their wives, with a sprinkling of American travelers and ranchmen. The impalpable adobe dust of the arena was being whirled into the air by the strong onset of the afternoon trade winds, which happily, however, helped also to dissipate a reek of garlic and the acrid fumes of cheap tobacco rolled in corn-husk cigarettes. I was leaning over the second barrier, waiting for the meager and circus-like procession to enter with the keys of the bullpen, when my attention was attracted to a movement in the reserved gallery. A lady and gentleman of a quality that was evidently unfamiliar to the rest of the audience were picking their way along the rickety benches to a front seat. I recognized the geologist with some surprise, and the lady was leading with still greater astonishment, for it was Miss Mannersley in her precise, well-fitting walking costume, a monotone of sober color among the party-colored audience. However, I was perhaps less surprised than the audience, for I was not only becoming as accustomed to the young girl's vagaries as I had been to Enriquez's extravagance, but I was also satisfied that her uncle might have given her permission to come as a recognition of the Sunday concession of the management, as well as to conciliate his supposed Catholic friends. I watched her sitting there until the first bull had entered, and after a rather brief play with the picadors and banderilleros was dispatched. At the moment when the matador approached the bull with his lethal weapon, I was not sorry for an excuse to glance at Miss Mannersley. Her hands were in her lap, her head slightly bent forward over her knees. I fancied that she too had dropped her eyes before the brutal situation. To my horror, I saw that she had a drawing book in her hand and was actually sketching it. I turned my eyes in preference to the dying bull. The second animal led out for this ingenious slaughter was, however, more sullen, uncertain, and discomposing to his butchers. He accepted the irony of a trial with gloomy, suspicious eyes, and he declined the challenge of viling and insulting picadors. He bristled with the banderilleros like a head hog, but remained with his haunches backed against the barrier, at times almost hidden in the fine dust raised by the monotonous stroke of his sullenly pawing hoof, his one dull, heavy protest. A vague uneasiness had infected his adversaries. The picadors held aloof. The banderilleros skirmished at a safe distance. The audience resented only the indecision of the bull. Galling epithets were flung at him, followed by cries of "Espada," and curving his elbow under his short cloak, the matador, with his flashing blade in hand, advanced and stopped. The bull remained motionless, for at that moment a heavier gust of wind than usual swept down upon the arena, lifted a suffocating cloud of dust, and whirled it around the tiers of benches and the balcony, and for a moment seemed to stop the performance. I heard an exclamation from the geologist, who had risen to his feet. I fancied I heard even a faint cry from Miss Mannersley, but the next moment, as the dust was slowly settling, we saw a sheet of paper in the air that had been caught up in the brief cyclone, dropping, dipping from side to side on uncertain wings until it slowly descended in the very middle of the arena. It was a leaf from Miss Mannersley's sketchbook, the one on which she had been sketching. In the pause that followed it seemed to be the one object that at last excited the bull's growing but tardy ire. He glanced at it with murky, distended eyes. He snorted at it with vague yet troubled fury. Whether he detected his own presentment in Miss Mannersley's sketch, or whether he recognized it as an unknown and unfamiliar treachery in his surroundings, I could not conjecture. For the next moment, the matador, taking advantage of the bull's concentration, with a complacent leer at the audience, advanced toward the paper, but at that instant a young man cleared the barrier into the arena with a single bound, shoved the matador to one side, caught up the paper, turned toward the balcony, and Miss Mannersley, with a gesture of apology, dropped gaily before the bull, knelt down before him with an exaggerated humility, and held up the drawing as if for his inspection. A roar of applause broke from the audience, a cry of warning and exasperation from the attendants, as the goaded bull suddenly charged the stranger. But he sprang to one side with great dexterity, made a courteous gesture to the matador as if passing the bull over to him, and still holding the paper in his hand, re-leaped the barrier and rejoined the audience in safety. I did not wait to see the deadly dominant thrust with which the matador received the charging bull. My eyes were following the figure, now bounding up the steps to the balcony, where with an exaggerated salutation he laid the drawing in Miss Mannersley's lap and vanished. There was no mistaking that thin-lipped form, the narrow black moustache, and gravely dancing eyes. The audacity of conception, the extravagance of execution, the quaint irony of the sequel could belong to no one but Enrique. I hurried up to her as the 6 yoked mules dragged the carcass of the bull away. She was placidly putting up her book, the unmoved focus of 100 eager and curious eyes. She smiled slightly as she saw me. I was just telling Mr. Briggs what an extraordinary creature it was, and how you knew him. He must have had great experience to do that sort of thing so cleverly and safely. Does he do it often? Of course, not just that. But does he pick up cigars and things that I see they throw to the matador? Does he belong to the management? Mr. Briggs thinks the whole thing was a feint to distract the bull, she added with a wicked glance at the geologist, who I fancied looked disturbed. I am afraid, I said dryly, that his act was unpremeditated and genuine as it was unusual. Why afraid? It was a matter-of-fact question, but I instantly saw my mistake. What right had I to assume that Enrique's attentions were any more genuine than her own easy indifference? And if I suspected that they were, was it fair in me to give my friend away to this heartless coquette? You are not very gallant, she said, with a slight laugh as I was hesitating, and turned away with her escort before I could frame a reply. But at least Enrique was now accessible, and I should gain some information from him. I knew where to find him, unless he was still lounging about the building, intent upon more extravagance. But I waited until I saw Miss Mannersley and Briggs depart without further interruption. The hacienda of Roman Saltillo, Enrique's cousin, was on the outskirts of the village. When I arrived there, I found Enrique's Pinto Mustang steaming in the corral, and although I was momentarily delayed by the servants at the gateway, I was surprised to find Enrique himself lying languidly on his back in a hammock in the patio. His arms were hanging down listlessly on each side, as if in the greatest prostration, yet I could not resist the impression that the rascal had only just got into the hammock when he heard of my arrival. "You have arrived, friend Pancho, in time," he said in accents of exaggerated weakness. "I am absolutely exhausted. I am busted, caved in, kerflumoxed. I have behold you, my friend, at the barrier. I speak not. I make no sign at the first, because I was on fire. I speak not at the finish, for I am exhausted. I see, the bull made it lively for you." He instantly bounded up in the hammock. "The bull, caramba! Not 1,000 bulls, and this one, look you, was a craven." I snapped my fingers over his horn. I rolled my cigarette under his nose. "Well, then what was it?" He instantly lay down again, pulling up the sides of the hammock. Presently his voice came from its depths, appealing in hollow tones to the sky. He asks me, "These friend of my soul, these brother of my life, these Pancho that I love, what it was?" He would that I should tell him why I am game in the legs, why I shake in the hand, crack in the voice, and am generally wipe out. And yet he, my partner, this Francisco, know that I have seen this miss from Boston, that I have gazed into the eye, touched the hand, and for the instant possess a picture that hand have drawn. It was a sublime picture, Pancho, he said, sitting up again suddenly, and have killed the bull before our friend Peep's sword have touched even the bone of his back and make finish of him. "Look here, Enrique," I said bluntly, "have you been serenading that girl?" He shrugged his shoulders with the least embarrassment and said, "Ah, yes, what would you? It's of a necessity." "Well," I retorted, "then you ought to know that her uncle took it all to himself. Thought you some grateful Catholic pleased with his religious tolerance." He did not even smile. "You know," he said gravely, "that makes something too. In this affair it's well to begin with the duenna. He is the duenna." And I went on relentlessly. "Her escort told her just now that your exploit in the bull ring was only a trick to divert the bull suggested by the management. Bah! Her escort is a geologian. Naturally, she is to him as a stone. I would have continued, but a peon interrupted us at this moment with a sign to Enrique, who leaped briskly from the hammock, bidding me wait his return from a messenger in the gateway. Still unsatisfied of mind, I waited and sat down in the hammock that Enrique had quitted. A scrap of paper was lying in its meshes, which at first appeared to be of the kind from which Enrique rolled his cigarettes. But as I picked it up to throw it away, I found it was a much firmer and stouter material. Looking at it more closely, I was surprised to recognize it as a piece of the tinted drawing paper torn off the block that Miss Mannersley had used. It had been deeply creased at right angles as if it had been folded. It looked as if it might have been the outer half of a sheet used for a note. It might have been a trifling circumstance, but it greatly excited my curiosity. I knew that he had returned the sketch to Miss Mannersley, for I had seen it in her hand. Had she given him another? And if so, why had it been folded to the destruction of the drawing? Or was it a part of a note which he had destroyed? In the first impulse of discovery, I walked quickly with it toward the gateway where Enrique had disappeared, intending to restore it to him. He was just outside talking with a young girl. I started, for it was Jocasta, Miss Mannersley's maid. With this added discovery came that sense of uneasiness and indignation with which we illogically are apt to resent the withholding of a friend's confidence, even matters concerning only himself. It was no use for me to reason that it was no business of mine, that he was right in keeping a secret that concerned another and a lady. But I was afraid. I was even more meanly resentful because the discovery quite upset my theory of his conduct and of Miss Mannersley's attitude toward him. I continued to walk on to the gateway, where I bade Enrique a hurried goodbye, alleging the sudden remembrance of another engagement, but without appearing to recognize the girl, who was moving away when, to my further discomfiture, the rascal stopped me with an appealing wink, threw his arms around my neck, whispered hoarsely in my ear, "Ah, you see, you comprehend? But you are the mirror of discretion," and returned to Jocasta. But whether this meant that he had received a message from Miss Mannersley, or that he was trying to suborn her maid to carry one, was still uncertain. He was capable of either. During the next 2 or 3 weeks, I saw him frequently, but as I had resolved to try the effect of ignoring Miss Mannersley in our conversation, I gathered little further of their relations. To my surprise, after 1 or 2 characteristic extravagances of allusion, Enrique dropped the subject too. Only one afternoon, as we were parting, he said carelessly, "My friend, you are going to the Casa of Mannersley tonight. I too have the honor of the invitation, but you will be my Mercury, my Leporello. You will take of me a message to these Miss Boston, that I am crushed, desolated, prostrate, and flabbergasted, that I cannot arrive, for I have of that night to sit up with the grand aunt of my brother-in-law, who has a quinsy to the death. It's sad." This was the first indication I had received of Miss Mannersley's advances. I was equally surprised at Enrique's refusal. "Nonsense," I said bluntly. "Nothing keeps you from going." "My friend," returned Enrique, with a sudden lapse into languishment that seemed to make him absolutely infirm, "it's everything that shall restrain me. I am not strong. I shall become weak of the knee, and tremble under the eye of Miss Boston. I shall precipitate myself to the geologian by the throat. Ask me another conundrum that shall be easy." He seemed idiotically inflexible and did not go. But I did. I found Miss Mannersley exquisitely dressed and looking singularly animated and pretty. The lambent glow of her inscrutable eye as she turned toward me might have been flattering but for my uneasiness in regard to Enrique. I delivered his excuses as naturally as I could. She stiffened for an instant and seemed an inch higher. "I am so sorry," she said at last in a level voice. "I thought he would have been so amusing. Indeed, I had hoped we might try an old Moorish dance together, which I have found and was practicing. He would have been delighted, I know." "It's a great pity he didn't come with me," I said quickly. But I could not help adding, with emphasis on her words, "He's such an extraordinary creature, you know." "I see nothing extraordinary in his devotion to an aged relative," returned Miss Mannersley quietly as she turned away, "except that it justifies my respect for his character. I do not know why I did not relate this to him. Possibly I had given up trying to understand them. Perhaps I was beginning to have an idea that he could take care of himself. But I was somewhat surprised a few days later when, after asking me to go with him to a rodeo at his uncle's, he added composedly, "You will meet Miss Boston." I stared, and but for his manner would have thought it part of his extravagance. For the rodeo, a yearly chase of wild cattle for the purpose of lassoing and branding them, was a rather brutal affair, and purely a man's function. It was also a family affair, a property stock-taking of the great Spanish cattle owners and strangers, particularly Americans, found it difficulty to gain access to its mysteries and the fiesta that followed. "But how did she get an invitation?" I asked. "You did not dare to ask," I began. "My friend," said Enrique with a singular deliberation, "the great and respectable Boston herself and her serene venerable uncle and other Boston magnificos have of a truth done me the inexpressible honor to solicit of my degraded papistical uncle that she shall come, that she shall of her own superior eye behold the barbaric customs of our race." His tone and manner were so peculiar that I stepped quickly before him, laid my hands on his shoulders, and looked down into his face. But the actual devil, which I now for the first time saw in his eyes, went out of them suddenly, and he relapsed again in affected languishment in his chair. "I shall be there, friend Pancho," he said, with a preposterous gasp. "I shall nerve my arm to lasso the bull, and tumble him before her at her feet. I shall throw the buck-jump mustang at the same sacred spot. I shall pluck for her the buried chicken at full speed from the ground and present it to her. You shall see it, friend Pancho. I shall be there." He was as good as his word. When Don Pedro Amador, his uncle, installed Miss Mannersley with Spanish courtesy on a raised platform in the long valley where the rodeo took place, the gallant Enrique selected a bull from the frightened and galloping herd, and cleverly isolating him from the band, lassoed his hind legs, and threw him exactly before the platform where Miss Mannersley was seated. It was Enrique who caught the unbroken mustang, sprang from his own saddle to the bare back of his captive, and with the lasso for a bridle, halted him on rigid haunches at Miss Mannersley's feet. It was Enrique who, in the sports that followed, leaned from his saddle at full speed, caught up the chicken buried to its head in the sand without wringing its neck, and tossed it unharmed and fluttering toward his mistress. As for her, she wore the same look of animation that I had seen in her face at our previous meeting. Although she did not bring her sketchbook with her, as at the bullfight, she did not shrink from the branding of the cattle which took place under her very eyes. Yet I had never seen her and Enrique together. They had never, to my actual knowledge, even exchanged words, and now, although she was the guest of his uncle, his duties seemed to keep him in the field and apart from her. Nor, as far as I could detect, did either apparently make any effort to have it otherwise. The peculiar circumstance seemed to attract no attention from anyone else. But for what I alone knew, or thought I knew, of their actual relations, I should have thought them strangers. But I felt certain that the fiesta which took place in the broad patio of Don Pedro's casa would bring them together, and later in the evening, as we were all sitting on the veranda watching the dancing of the Mexican women, whose white flounced sayas were monotonously rising and falling to the strains of two melancholy harps, Miss Mannersley rejoined us from the house. She seemed to be utterly absorbed and abstracted in the barbaric dances, and scarcely moved as she leaned over the railing with her cheek resting on her hand. Suddenly she arose with a little cry. "What is it?" asked two or three. Nothing, only I have lost my fan. She had risen and was looking abstractedly on the floor. Half a dozen men jumped to their feet. Let me fetch it, they said. No, thank you. I think I know where it is, and will go for it myself. She was moving away. But Don Pedro interposed with Spanish gravity. Such a thing was not to be heard of in his casa. If the senorita would not permit him, an old man, to go for it, it must be brought by Enrique, her cavalier of the day. But Enrique was not to be found. I glanced at Miss Mannersley's somewhat disturbed face and begged her to let me fetch it. I thought I saw a flush of relief came into her pale cheek as she said in a lower voice, "On the stone seat in the garden." I hurried away, leaving Don Pedro still protesting. I knew the gardens and the stone seat at an angle of the wall, not a dozen yards from the casa. The moon shone full upon it. There, indeed, lay the little grey-feathered fan, but beside it also lay the crumpled black gold embroidered riding gauntlet that Enrique had worn at the rodeo. I thrust it hurriedly into my pocket and ran back. As I passed through the gateway, I asked the peon to send Enrique to me. The man stared. Did I not know that Don Enrique had ridden away 2 minutes ago? When I reached the veranda, I handed the fan to Miss Mannersley without a word. "You know," said Don Pedro gravely, "it's as well. There shall be no bones broken over the getting of it, for Enrique, I hear, has had to return to Encinal this very evening." Miss Mannersley retired early. I did not inform her of my discovery, nor did I seek in any way to penetrate her secret. There was no doubt that she and Enrique had been together, perhaps not for the first time, but what was the result of their interview? From the young girl's demeanor and Enrique's hurried departure, I could only fear the worst for him. Had he been tempted into some further extravagance and been angrily rebuked, or had he avowed a real passion concealed under his exaggerated mask and been deliberately rejected? I tossed uneasily half the night, following in my dreams my poor friend's hurrying hoofbeats, and ever starting from my sleep at what I thought was the sound of galloping hoofs. I rose early and lounged into the patio, but others were there before me, and a small group of Don Pedro's family were excitedly discussing something, and I fancied they turned away awkwardly and consciously as I approached. There was an air of indefinite uneasiness everywhere. A strange fear came over me with the chill of the early morning air. Had anything happened to Enrique? I had always looked upon his extravagance as part of his playful humor. Could it be possible that under the sting of rejection he had made his grotesque threat of languishing effacement real? Surely Miss Mannersley would know or suspect something if it were the case. I approached one of the Mexican women and asked if the senorita had risen. The woman started and looked covertly round before she replied. Did not Pancho know that Miss Mannersley and her maid had not slept in their beds that night, but had gone? None knew where? For an instant I felt an appalling sense of my own responsibility in this suddenly serious situation, and hurried after retreating family group. But as I entered the corridor, a vaquero touched me on the shoulder. He had evidently just dismounted and was covered with the dust of the road. He handed me a note written in pencil on a leaf from Miss Mannersley's sketchbook. It was in Enrique's hand, and his signature was followed by his most extravagant rubric. Friend Pancho, when you read this line, you shall of a possibility think I am no more. That's where you shall slip up, my little brother. I am much more. I am 2 times as much. I have married Miss Boston at the Mission Church at 5 of the morning sharp. No cart shall be left. I kiss the hand of my venerable uncle-in-law. You shall say to him that we fly to the South Wilderness as a combined evangelical missionary to the heathen. Miss Boston herself said this. Tata, how are you now? Your own Enrique. End of the Devotion of Enriquez.